Chapter 26 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 26. The Sunday before Lance Gardley started east on his journey of reparation, two strangers slipped quietly into the back of the schoolhouse during the singing of the first hymn and sat down in the shadow by the door. Margaret was playing the piano when they came in and did not see them, and when she turned back to her scripture lesson she had time for but the briefest of glances. She supposed they must be some visitors from the fort, as they were speaking to the captain's wife, who came over occasionally to the Sunday service, perhaps because it afforded an opportunity for a ride with one of the young officers. These occasional visitors who came for amusement and curiosity had ceased to trouble Margaret. Her real work was with the men and women and children who loved the services for their own sake, and she tried as much as possible to forget outsiders. So, that day everything went on just as usual, Margaret putting her heart into the prayer, the simple story-like reading of the scripture, and the other story sermon which followed it. Gardley sang unusually well at the close, a wonderful bit from an oratorio that he and Margaret had been practicing. But when toward the close of the little vesper service Margaret gave opportunity, as she often did, for others to take part in sentence prayers, one of the strangers from the back of the room stood up and began to pray. And such a prayer! Heaven seemed to bend low, and earth to kneel and beseech as the stranger man, with a face like an archangel and a body of an athlete clothed in a brown flannel shirt and khakis, besought the Lord of Heaven for a blessing on this gathering and on the leader of this little company who had so wonderfully led them to see the Christ and their need of salvation through the lesson of the day. And it did not need Bud's low-breathed whisper, "The missionary," to tell Margaret who he was. His face told her. His prayer thrilled her, and his strong, young, true voice made her sure that here was a man of God in truth. When the prayer was over and Margaret stood once more shyly facing her audience, she could scarcely keep the tremble out of her voice. "Oh," said she, casting aside ceremony, "if I had known the missionary was here, I should not have dared to try and lead this meeting today. Won't you please come up here and talk to us for a little while now, Mr. Brownlee?" At once he came forward eagerly, as if each opportunity were a pleasure. "Why, surely I want to speak a word to you, just to say how glad I am to see you all, and to experience what a wonderful teacher you have found since I went away. But I wouldn't have missed this meeting today for all the sermons I ever wrote or preached. You don't need any more sermon than the remarkable story you've just been listening to. And I've only one word to add, and that is that I've found, since I went away, that Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, is just the same Jesus to me today that he was the last time I spoke to you. He is just as ready to forgive your sin, to comfort you in sorrow, to help you in temptation, to raise your body in the resurrection, and to take you home to a mansion in his Father's house, as he was the day he hung upon the cross to save your soul from death. I've found I can rest just as securely upon the Bible as the Word of God as when I first tested its promises. Heaven and earth may pass away, but his word shall never pass away." "Go to it!" said Jasper Kemp under his breath, in the tone some men say "Amen," and his brows were drawn as if he were watching a battle. Margaret couldn't help wondering if he were thinking of the Reverend Frederick West just then. When the service was over the missionary brought his wife forward to Margaret, and they loved each other at once. Just another sweet girl like Margaret. She was lovely, with a delicacy of feature that betokened the high-born and high-bred, but dressed in a dainty khaki riding costume, if that uncompromising fabric could ever be called dainty. Margaret, remembering it afterward, wondered what it had been that gave it that unique individuality, and decided it was perhaps a combination of cut and finish and little dainty accessories. A bit of creamy lace at the throat of the rolling collar, a touch of golden brown velvet in a golden clasp, the flash of a wonderful jewel on her finger, the modeling of the small brown cap with its two eagle quills, all set the little woman apart and made her fit to enter any well-dressed company of riders in some great city park or fashionable drive. Yet here in the wilderness she was not overdressed. The 8 men from the camp stood in solemn row, waiting to be recognized, and behind them, abashed and grinning with embarrassment, stood Pop and Mom Wallis. Mom with her new gray bonnet glorifying her old face till the missionary's wife had to look twice to be sure who she was. And now, surely, Hazel, we must have these dear people come over and help us with the singing sometimes. Can't we try something right now? Said the missionary, looking first at his wife and then at Margaret and Gardley. This man is a newcomer since I went away, but I'm mighty sure he is the right kind, and I'm glad to welcome him. Or perhaps I would better ask if he will welcome me. And with his rare smile, the missionary put out his hand to Gardley, who took it with an eager grasp. The 2 men stood looking at each other for a moment, as rare men rarely met, sometimes do even on a sinful earth, and after that clasp and that look they turned away, brothers for life. That was a most interesting song rehearsal that followed. It would be rare to find 4 voices like those even in a cultivated musical center, and they blended as if they had been made for one another. The men from the bunkhouse and a lot of other people silently dropped again into their seats to listen as the 4 sang on. The missionary took the bass and his wife the alto, and the 4 made music worth listening to. The rare and lovely thing about it was that they sang to souls, not alone for ears, and so their music, classical though it was, and of the highest order, appealed keenly to the hearts of these rough men, and made them feel that heaven had opened for them, as once before for untaught shepherds, and let down a ladder of angelic voices. I shall feel better about leaving you out here while I am gone, since they have come, said Gardley that night when he was bidding Margaret good night. I couldn't bear to think there were none of your own kind about you. The others are devoted and would do for you with their lives if need be, as far as they know. But I like you to have real friends, real Christian friends. This man is what I call a Christian. I'm not sure, but he is the first minister that I have ever come close to who has impressed me as believing what he preaches and living it. I suppose there are others. I haven't known many. That man West that was here when you came was a mistake. He didn't even preach much, smiled Margaret. So how could he live it? This man is real, and there are others. Oh, I have known a lot of them that are living lives of sacrifice and loving service, and are yet just as strong and happy and delightful as if they were millionaires. But they are the men who have not thrown away their Bibles and their Christ. They believe every promise in God's word and rest on them day by day, testing them and proving them over and over. I wish you knew my father. I am going to, said Gardley proudly. I am going to him just as soon as I have finished my business and straightened out my affairs, and I am going to tell him everything. With your permission, Margaret. Oh, how beautiful, cried Margaret with happy tears in her eyes. To think you are going to see father and mother. I have wanted them to know the real you. I couldn't half tell you the real you in a letter. Perhaps they won't look on me with your sweet blindness, dear, he said, smiling tenderly down on her. Perhaps they will see only my dark past life, for I mean to tell your father everything. I'm not going to have any skeletons in the closet to cause pain hereafter. Perhaps your father and mother will not feel like giving their daughter to me after they know. Remember, I realize just what a rare prize she is. No, father is not like that, Lance, said Margaret with her rare smile lighting up her happy eyes. Father and mother will understand. But if they do not? There was the shadow of sadness in Gardley's eyes as he asked the question. "I belong to you, dear, anyway," she said with sweet surrender. "I trust you, though the whole world were against you." For answer Gardley took her in his arms, a look of awe upon his face, and stooping, laid his lips upon hers in tender reverence. "Margaret, you wonderful Margaret," he said. "God has blessed me more than any other man in sending you to me. With His help I will be worthy of you." 3 days more, and Margaret was alone with her school work, her 2 missionary friends 30 miles away, her eager watching for the mail to come, her faithful attendant Bud, and for comfort the purple mountain with its changing glory in the distance. A few days before Gardley left for the East he had been offered a position by Rogers as general manager of his estate at a fine salary, and after consultation with Margaret he decided to accept it. But the question of their marriage they had left by common consent unsettled until Gardley should return and be able to offer his future wife a record made as fair and clean as human effort could make it after human mistakes had unmade it. As Margaret worked and waited, wrote her charming letters to father and mother and lover, and thought her happy thoughts with only the mountain for confidant, she did not plan for the future except in a dim and dreamy way. She would make those plans with Gardley when he returned. Probably they must wait some time before they could be married. Gardley would have to earn some money, and she must earn too. She must keep the Ashland school for another year. It had been rather understood when she came out that if at all possible she would remain 2 years at least. It was hard to think of not going home for the summer vacation, but the trip cost a great deal and was not to be thought of. There was already a plan suggested to have a summer session of the school, and if that went through, of course she might stay right in Ashland. It was hard to think of not seeing her father and mother for another long year, but perhaps Gardley would be returning before the summer was over, and then it would not be so hard. However, she tried to put those thoughts out of her mind and do her work happily. It was incredible that Arizona should have become suddenly so blank and uninteresting since the departure of a man whom she had not known a few short months before. Margaret had long since written to her father and mother about Gardley's first finding her in the desert. The thing had become history and was not likely to alarm them. She had been in Arizona long enough to be acquainted with things, and they would not be always thinking of her as sitting on stray water tanks in the desert. So she told them about it, for she wanted them to know Gardley as he had been to her. The letters that had traveled back and forth between New York and Arizona had been full of Gardley, and still Margaret had not told her parents how it was between them. Gardley had asked that he might do that. Yet it had been a blind father and mother who had not long ago read between the lines of those letters and understood. Margaret fancied she detected a certain sense of relief in her mother's letters after she knew that Gardley had gone East. Were they worrying about him, she wondered, or was it just the natural dread of a mother to lose her child? So Margaret settled down to school routine and more made a confidant of Bud concerning little matters of the school. If it had not been for Bud at that time, Margaret would have been lonely indeed. 2 or 3 times since Gardley left, the Brownleys had ridden over to Sunday service, and once had stopped for a few minutes during the week on their way to visit some distant need. These occasions were a delight to Margaret, for Hazel Brownley was a kindred spirit. She was looking forward with pleasure to the visit she was to make them at the mission station as soon as school closed. She had been there once with Gardley before he left. But the ride was too long to go often, and the only escort available was Bud. Besides, she could not get away from school and the Sunday service at present, but it was pleasant to have something to look forward to. Meantime, the spring commencement was coming on, and Margaret had her hands full. She had undertaken to inaugurate a real commencement with Class Day, and as much form and ceremony as she could introduce in order to create a good school spirit. But such things were not done with the turn of a hand, and the young teacher sadly missed Gardley in all these preparations. At this time Rosa Rogers was Margaret's particular thorn in the flesh. Since the night that Forsythe had quit the play and ridden forth into the darkness, Rosa had regarded her teacher with baleful eyes. Gardley, too, she hated, and was only waiting with smoldering wrath until her wild, ungoverned soul could take its revenge. She felt that but for those two, Forsythe would still have been with her. Margaret, realizing the passionate, untaught nature of the motherless girl and her great need of a friend to guide her, made attempt after attempt to reach and befriend her, but every attempt was met with repulse and the sharp word of scorn. Rosa had been too long the petted darling of a father who was utterly blind to her faults to be other than spoiled. Her own way was the only thing that ruled her. By her will she had ruled every nurse and servant about the place, and wheedled her father into letting her do anything the whim prompted. Twice her father, through the advice of friends, had tried the experiment of sending her away to school, once to an Eastern finishing school, and once to a convent on the Pacific coast, only to have her return shortly by request of the school, more willful than when she had gone away. And now she ruled supreme in her father's home, disliked by most of the servants, save those whom she chose to favor because they could be made to serve her purposes. Her father, engrossed in his business and away much of the time, was bound up in her and saw few of her faults. It is true that when a fault of hers did come to his notice, however, he dealt with it most severely and grieved over it in secret, for the girl was much like the mother whose loss had emptied the world of its joy for him. But Rosa knew well how to manage her father and wheedle him, and also how to hide her own doings from his knowledge. Rosa's eyes, dimples, pink cheeks, and coquettish little mouth were not idle in these days. She knew how to have every pupil at her feet and ready to obey her slightest wish. She wielded her power to its fullest extent as the summer drew near, and day after day saw a slow torture for Margaret. Some days the menacing air of insurrection fairly bristled in the room, and Margaret could not understand how some of her most devoted followers seemed to be in the forefront of battle, until one day she looked up quickly and caught the lynx-eyed glance of Rosa as she turned from smiling at the boys in the back seat. Then she understood. Rosa had cast her spell upon the boys, and they were acting under it and not of their own clear judgment. It was the world-old battle of sex, of woman against woman for the winning of the man to do her will. Margaret, using all the charm of her lovely personality to uphold standards of right, truth, purity, high living, and earnest thinking. Rosa striving with her impish beauty to lure them into any mischief, so it foiled the others' purposes. And one day Margaret faced the girl alone, looking steadily into her eyes with sad, searching gaze, and almost a yearning to try to lead the pretty child to finer things. "Rosa, why do you always act as if I were your enemy?" she said sadly. "Because you are," said Rosa with a toss of her independent head. "Indeed, I'm not, dear child," she said, putting out her hand to lay it on the girl's shoulder kindly. "I want to be your friend." "I'm not a child," snapped Rosa, jerking her shoulder angrily away, "and you can never be my friend because I hate you." "Rosa, look here," said Margaret, following the girl toward the door, the color rising in her cheeks and a desire growing in her heart to conquer this poor, passionate creature and win her for better things. "Rosa, I cannot have you say such things. Tell me why you hate me. What have I done that you should feel that way? I'm sure if we should talk it over we might come to some better understanding." Rosa stood defiant in the doorway. "We could never come to any better understanding, Miss Earle," she declared in a cold, hard tone, "because I understand you now, and I hate you. You tried your best to get my friend away from me, but you couldn't do it, and you would like to keep me from having any boy friends at all, but you can't do that either. You think you are very popular, but you'll find out I always do what I like, and you needn't try to stop me. I don't have to come to school unless I choose, and as long as I don't break your rules, you have no complaint coming. But you needn't think you can pull the wool over my eyes the way you do the others by pretending to be friends. I won't be friends. I hate you." And Rosa turned grandly and marched out of the schoolhouse. Margaret stood gazing sadly after her and wondering if her failure here were her fault, if there was anything else she ought to have done, if she had let her personal dislike of the girl influence her conduct. She sat for some time at her desk, her chin in her hands, her eyes fixed on vacancy with a hopeless, discouraged expression in them, before she became aware of another presence in the room. Looking around quickly, she saw that Bud was sitting motionless at his desk, his forehead wrinkled in a fierce frown, his jaw set belligerently, and a look of such unutterable pity and devotion in his eyes that her heart warmed to him at once, and a smile of comradeship broke over her face. "Oh, William, were you here? Did you hear all that? What do you suppose is the matter? Where have I failed?" "You ain't failed anywhere. You should worry about her. She's a nut. If she was a boy, I'd punch her head for you. But seeing she's only a girl, you should worry. She always was the limit." Bud's tone was forcible. He was the only one of all the boys who never yielded to Rosa's charms, but sat in glowering silence when she exercised her powers on the school and created pandemonium for the teacher. Bud's attitude was comforting. It had a touch of manliness and gentleness about it, quite unwonted for him. It suggested beautiful possibilities for the future of his character, and Margaret smiled tenderly. "Thank you, dear boy," she said gently. "You certainly are a comfort. If every one was as splendid as you are, we should have a model school. But I do wish I could help Rosa. I can't see why she should hate me so. I must have made some big mistake with her in the first place to antagonize her." "Naw," said Bud roughly. "No chance. She's just a nut, that's all. She's got a case on that Forsythe guy, the worst kind, and she's afraid somebody'll get him away from her. The poor stew, as if anybody would get a case on a tough guy like that. Gee, you should worry. Come on, let's take a ride over to camp." With a sigh and a smile, Margaret accepted Bud's consolations and went on her way, trying to find some manner of showing Rosa what a real friend she was willing to be. But Rosa continued obdurate and hateful, regarding her teacher with haughty indifference, except when she was called upon to recite, which she did sometimes with scornful condescension, sometimes with pert perfection, and sometimes with saucy humor which convulsed the whole room. Margaret's patience was almost ceasing to be a virtue, and she meditated often whether she ought not to request that the girl be withdrawn from the school. Yet she reflected that it was a very short time now until commencement, and that Rosa had not openly defied any rules. It was merely a personal antagonism. Then, too, if Rosa were taken from the school, there was really no other good influence in the girl's life at present. Day by day Margaret prayed about the matter and hoped that something would develop to make plain her way. After much thought in the matter, she decided to go on with her plans, letting Rosa have her place in the commencement program and her part in the class day doings as if nothing were the matter. Certainly there was nothing laid down in the rules of a public school that proscribed a scholar who did not love her teacher. Why should the fact that one had incurred the hate of a pupil unfit that pupil for her place in her class so long as she did her duties? And Rosa did hers promptly and deftly, with certain piquant originality that Margaret could not help but admire. Sometimes, as the teacher cast a furtive look at the pretty girl working away at her desk, she wondered what was going on behind the lovely mask, but the look in Rosa's eyes when she raised them was both deep and sly. Rosa's hatred was indeed deep-rooted. Whatever heart she had not frivoled away in willfulness had been caught and won by Forsythe, the first grown man who had ever dared to make real love to her. Her jealousy of Margaret was the most intense thing that had ever come into her life. To think of him looking at Margaret, talking to Margaret, smiling at Margaret, walking or riding with Margaret, was enough to send her writhing upon her bed in the darkness of a wakeful night. She would clench her pretty hands until the nails dug into the flesh and brought the blood. She would bite the pillow or the blankets with an almost fiendish clenching of her teeth upon them and mutter, as she did so. "I hate her! I hate her! I could kill her!" The day her first letter came from Forsythe, Rosa held her head high and went about the school as if she were a princess royal and Margaret were the dust under her feet. Triumph sat upon her like a crown and looked forth regally from her eyes. She laid her hand upon her heart and felt the crackle of his letter inside her blouse. She dreamed with her eyes upon the distant mountain and thought of the tender names he had called her, "Little wild rose of his heart," "No rose in all the world until you came," and a lot of other meaningful sentences. A real love letter all her own. No sharing him with any hateful teachers. He had implied in her letter that she was the only one of all the people in that region to whom he cared to write. He had said he was coming back some day to get her. Her young, wild heart throbbed exultantly as her eyes looked forth their triumph malignantly. When he did come, she would take care that he stayed close by her. No conceited teacher from the East should lure him from her side. She would prepare her guiles and smile her sweetest. She would wear fine garments from abroad and show him she could far outshine that quiet, common Miss Earle with all her airs. Yet to this end she studied hard. It was no part of her plan to be left behind at graduating time. She would please her father by taking a prominent part in things and outdoing all the others. Then he would give her what she liked, jewels and silk dresses and all the things a girl should have who had won a lover like hers. The last busy days before commencement were especially trying for Margaret. It seemed as if the children were possessed with the very spirit of mischief, and she could not help but see that it was Rosa who, sitting demurely in her desk, was the center of it all. Only Bud's steady, frowning countenance of all that rollicking, roistering crowd kept loyalty with the really beloved teacher. For indeed they loved her, every one but Rosa, and would have stood by her to a man and girl when it really came to the pinch. But in a matter like a bit of fun in these last few days of school, and when challenged to it by the school beauty who did not usually condescend to any but a few of the older boys, where was the harm? They were so flattered by Rosa's smiles that they failed to see Margaret's worn, weary wistfulness. Bud, coming into the schoolhouse late one afternoon in search of her after the other scholars had gone, found Margaret with her head down upon the desk and her shoulders shaken with soundless sobs. He stood for a second silent in the doorway, gazing helplessly at her grief. Then, with the delicacy of one boy for another, he slipped back outside the door and stood in the shadow, grinding his teeth. "Gee!" he said under his breath. "Oh, gee! I'd like to punch her fool head. I don't care if she is a girl. She needs it. Gee, if she was a boy, wouldn't I settle her? The little darned mean snake!" His remarks, it is needless to say, did not have reference to his beloved teacher. It was in the atmosphere everywhere that something was bound to happen if this strain kept up. Margaret knew it and felt utterly inadequate to meet it. Rosa knew it and was awaiting her opportunity. Bud knew it and could only stand and watch where the blow was to strike first and be ready to ward it off. In these days he wished fervently for Gardley's return. He did not know just what Gardley could do about that little fool, as he called Rosa, but it would be a relief to be able to tell someone all about it. If he only dared leave, he would go over and tell Jasper Kemp about it, just to share his burden with somebody. But as it was, he must stick to the job for the present and bear his great responsibility, and so the days hastened by to the last Sunday before commencement, which was to be on Monday. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 27. Margaret had spent Saturday in rehearsals, so that there had been no rest for her. Sunday morning she slept late and awoke from a troubled dream, unrested. She almost meditated whether she would not ask someone to read a sermon at the afternoon service and let her go on sleeping. Then a memory of the lonely old woman at the camp and the men who came so regularly to the service roused her to effort once more, and she arose and tried to prepare a little something for them. She came into the schoolhouse at the hour looking fagged, with dark circles under her eyes, and the loving eyes of Mom Wallis, already in her front seat, watched her keenly. "It's time for him to come back," she said in her heart. "She's getting peaked. I wished he'd come." Margaret had hoped that Rosa would not come. The girl was not always there, but of late she had been quite regular, coming in late with her father just a little after the story had begun, and attracting attention by her smiles and bows and giggling whispers, which sometimes were so audible as to create quite a diversion from the speaker. But Rosa came in early to day and took a seat directly in front of Margaret, in about the middle of the house, fixing her eyes on her teacher with a kind of settled intention that made Margaret shrink as if from a danger she was not able to meet. There was something bright and hard and daring in Rosa's eyes as she stared unwinkingly, as if she had come to search out a weak spot for her evil purposes. And Margaret was so tired she wanted to lay her head down on her desk and cry. She drew some comfort from the reflection that if she should do so childish a thing she would be at once surrounded by a strong battalion of friends from the camp, who would shield her with their lives if necessary. It was silly, of course, and she must control this choking in her throat. Only how was she ever going to talk with Rosa looking at her that way? It was like a nightmare pursuing her. She turned to the piano and kept them all singing for a while, so that she might pray in her heart and grow calm. And when, after her brief, earnest prayer, she lifted her eyes to the audience, she saw with intense relief that the Brownleys were in the audience. She started a hymn that they all knew, and when they were well in the midst of the first verse, she slipped from the piano stool and walked swiftly down the aisle to Brownley's side. "Would you please talk to them a while?" she pleaded wistfully. "I am so tired. I feel as if I just couldn't today." Instantly Brownlee followed her back to the desk and took her place, pulling out his little worn Bible and opening it with familiar fingers to a beloved passage. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The words fell on Margaret's tired heart like balm, and she rested her head back against the wall and closed her eyes to listen. Sitting so away from Rosa's stare, she could forget for a while the absurd burdens that had got on her nerves, and could rest down hard upon her Savior. Every word that the man of God spoke seemed meant just for her, and brought strength, courage, and new trust to her heart. She forgot the little crowd of other listeners and took the message to herself, drinking it in eagerly, as one who has been a long time ministering accepts a much-needed ministry. When she moved to the piano again for the closing hymn, she felt new strength within her to bear the trials of the week that were before her. She turned, smiling and brave, to speak to those who always crowded around to shake hands and have a word before leaving. Hazel, putting a loving arm around her as soon as she could get up to the front, began to speak soothingly. "You poor tired child," she said. "You are almost worn to a frazzle. You need a big change, and I'm going to plan it for you just as soon as I possibly can. How would you like to go with us on our trip among the Indians? Wouldn't it be great? It'll be several days, depending on how far we go, but John wants to visit the Hopi reservation, if possible, and it'll be so interesting. They are a most strange people. We'll have a delightful trip, sleeping out under the stars, you know. Don't you just love it? I do. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I can't be sure, for a few days yet, when we can go, for John has to make a journey in the other direction first, and he isn't sure when he can return. But it might be this week. How soon can you come to us? How I wish we could take you right home with us tonight. You need to get away and rest. But your commencement is tomorrow, isn't it? I'm so sorry we can't be here, but this other matter is important, and John has to go early in the morning. Someone very sick who wants to see him before he dies. An old Indian who didn't know a thing about Jesus till John found him one day. I suppose you haven't anybody who could bring you over to us after your work is done here tomorrow night or Tuesday, have you? Well, we'll see if we can't find someone to send for you soon. There's an old Indian who often comes this way, but he's away buying cattle. Maybe John can think of a way we could send for you early in the week. Then you would be ready to go with us on the trip. You would like to go, wouldn't you? Oh, so much, said Margaret, with a sigh of wistfulness. I can't think of anything pleasanter. Margaret turned suddenly, and there, just behind her, almost touching her, stood Rosa, that strange, baleful gleam in her eyes, like a serpent who was biding her time, drawing nearer and nearer, knowing she had her victim where she could not move before she struck. It was a strange fancy, of course, and one that was caused by sick nerves, but Margaret drew back and almost cried out, as if for someone to protect her. Then her strong common sense came to the rescue, and she rallied and smiled at Rosa, a faint little sorry smile. It was hard to smile at the bright, baleful face with the menace in the eyes. Hazel was watching her. You poor child. You're quite worn out. I'm afraid you're going to be sick. Oh, no, said Margaret, trying to speak cheerfully. Things have just got on my nerves, that's all. It's been a particularly trying time. I shall be all right when tomorrow night is over. Well, we're going to send for you very soon, so be ready. And Hazel followed her husband, waving her hand in gay parting. Rosa was still standing just behind her when Margaret turned back to her desk, and the younger girl gave her one last dagger look, a glitter in her eyes so sinister and vindictive that Margaret felt a shudder run through her whole body, and was glad that just then Rosa's father called to her that they must be starting home. Only one more day now of Rosa, and she would be done with her, perhaps forever. The girl was through the school course and was graduating. It was not likely she would return another year. Her opportunity was over to help her. She had failed. Why, she couldn't tell, but she had strangely failed, and all she asked now was not to have to endure the hard, cold, young presence any longer. Sick nerves, Margaret, she said to herself. Go home and go to bed. You'll be all right tomorrow. And she locked the schoolhouse door and walked quietly home with the faithful Bud. The past month had been a trying time also for Rosa. Young, wild, and motherless, passionate, willful, and impetuous, she was finding life tremendously exciting just now. With no one to restrain her or warn her she was playing with forces that she did not understand. She had subjugated easily all the boys in school, keeping them exactly where she wanted them for her purpose, and using methods that would have done credit to a woman of the world. But by far the greatest force in her life was her infatuation for Forsythe. The letters had traveled back and forth many times between them since Forsythe wrote that first love letter. He found a whimsical pleasure in her deep devotion and naive readiness to follow as far as he cared to lead her. He realized that, young as she was no innocent, which made the acquaintance all the more interesting. He, meantime, idled away a few months on the Pacific coast, making mild love to a rich California girl and considering whether or not he was ready yet to settle down. In the meantime, his correspondence with Rosa took on such a nature that his volatile, impulsive nature was stirred with a desire to see her again. It was not often that once out of sight he looked back to a victim, but Rosa had shown a daring and a spirit in her letters that sent a challenge to his sated senses. Moreover, the California heiress was going on a journey. Besides, an old enemy of his who knew altogether too much of his past had appeared on the scene, and as Gardley had been removed from the Ashland vicinity for a time, Forsythe felt it might be safe to venture back again. There was always that pretty, spirited little teacher if Rosa failed to charm. But why should Rosa not charm? And why should he not yield? Rosa's father was a good sort and had all kinds of property. Rosa was her father's only heir. On the whole, Forsythe decided that the best move he could make next would be to return to Arizona. If things turned out well, he might even think of marrying Rosa. This was somewhat the train of thought that led Forsythe at last to write to Rosa that he was coming, throwing Rosa into a panic of joy and alarm. For Rosa's father had been most explicit about her ever going out with Forsythe again. It had been the most relentless command he had ever laid upon her, spoken in a tone she hardly ever disobeyed. Moreover, Rosa was fearfully jealous of Margaret. If Forsythe should come and begin to hang around the teacher, Rosa felt she would go wild or do something terrible.
Perhaps even kill somebody.
She shut her sharp little white teeth fiercely down into her red underlip and vowed with flashing eyes that he should never see Margaret again if power of hers could prevent it. The letter from Forsythe had reached her on Saturday evening, and she had come to the Sunday service with the distinct idea of trying to plan how she might get rid of Margaret. It would be hard enough to evade her father's vigilance if he once found out the young man had returned, but to have him begin to go and see Margaret again was a thing she could not and would not stand. The idea obsessed her to the exclusion of all others, and made her watch her teacher as if by her very concentration of thought upon her some way out of the difficulty might be evolved, as if Margaret herself might give forth a hint of weakness somewhere that would show her how to plan. To the intent she had come close in the group with the others around the teacher at the close of the meeting, and so standing had overheard all that the Brownleys had said. The lightning flash of triumph that she cast at Margaret as she left the schoolhouse was her own signal that she had found a way at last. Her opportunity had come, and just in time. Forsythe was to arrive in Arizona sometime on Tuesday, and wanted Rosa to meet him at one of their old trysting places, out some distance from her father's house. He knew that school would just be over, for she had written him about commencement, and so he understood that she would be free. But he did not know that the place he had selected to meet her was on one of Margaret's favorite trails, where she and Bud often rode in the late afternoons, and that above all things Rosa wished to avoid any danger of meeting her teacher, for she not only feared that Forsythe's attention would be drawn away from her, but also that Margaret might feel it her duty to report to her father about her clandestine meeting. Rosa's heart beat high as she rode demurely home with her father, answering his pleasantries with smiles and dimples and a coaxing word, just as he loved to have her. But she was not thinking of her father, though she kept well her mask of interest in what he had to say. She was trying to plan how she might use what she had heard to get rid of Margaret Earle. If only Mrs. Brownleigh would do as she had hinted and send someone Tuesday morning to escort Miss Earle over to her home, all would be clear sailing for Rosa. But she dared not trust to such a possibility. There were not many escorts coming their way from Ganado, and Rosa happened to know that the old Indian who frequently escorted parties was off in another direction. She could not rest on any such hope. When she reached home she went at once to her room and sat beside her window, gazing off at the purple mountains in deep thought. Then she lighted a candle and went in search of a certain little Testament, long since neglected and covered with dust. She found it at last on the top of a pile of books in a dark closet and dragged it forth, eagerly turning the pages. Yes, there it was, and in it a small envelope directed to Miss Rosa Rogers in a fine, angular handwriting. The letter was from the missionary's wife to the little girl who had recited her texts so beautifully as to earn the Testament. Rosa carried it to her desk, secured a good light, and sat down to read it over carefully. No thought of her innocent, childish exultation over that letter came to her now. She was intent on one thing, the handwriting. Could she seize the secret of it and reproduce it? She had before often done so with great success. She could imitate Miss Earle's writing so perfectly that she often took an impish pleasure in changing words in the questions on the blackboard and making them read absurdly for the benefit of the school. It was such good sport to see the amazement on Margaret's face when her attention would be called to it by a hilarious class, and to watch her troubled brow when she read what she supposed she had written. When Rosa was but a little child she used to boast that she could write her father's name in perfect imitation of his signature, and often signed some trifling receipt for him just for amusement. A dangerous gift in the hands of a conscienceless girl. Yet this was the first time that Rosa had really planned to use her art in any serious way. Perhaps it never occurred to her that she was doing wrong. At present her heart was too full of hate and fear and jealous love to care for right or wrong or anything else. It is doubtful if she would have hesitated a second even if the thing she was planning had suddenly appeared to her in the light of a great crime. She seemed sometimes almost like a creature without moral sense, so swayed was she by her own desires and feelings. She was blind now to everything but her great desire to get Margaret out of the way and have Forsythe to herself. Long after her father and the servants were asleep, Rosa's light burned while she bent over her desk, writing. Page after page she covered with careful copies of Mrs. Brownleigh's letter written to herself almost 3 years before. Finally she wrote out the alphabet, bit by bit, as she picked it from the words, learning just how each letter was habitually formed, the small letters and the capitals, with the peculiarities of connection and ending. At last, when she lay down to rest, she felt herself capable of writing a pretty fair letter in Mrs. Brownleigh's handwriting. The next thing was to make her plan and compose her letter. She lay staring into the darkness and trying to think just what she could do. In the first place, she settled it that Margaret must be gotten to Walpi at least. It would not do to send her to Ganado, where the mission station was, for that was a comparatively short journey, and she could easily go in a day. When the fraud was discovered, as of course it would be when Mrs. Brownleigh heard of it, Margaret would perhaps return to find out who had done it. No, she must be sent all the way to Walpi if possible. That would take at least 2 nights and the most of 2 days to get there. Forsythe had said his stay was to be short. By the time Margaret got back from Walpi, Forsythe would be gone. But how manage to get her to Walpi without her suspicions being aroused? She might word the note so that Margaret would be told to come halfway, expecting to meet the missionaries, say at Keams. There was a trail straight up from Ashland to Keams, cutting off quite a distance and leaving Ganado off at the right. Keams was nearly 40 miles west of Ganado. That would do nicely. Then, if she could manage to have another note left at Keams saying they could not wait and had gone on, Margaret would suspect nothing and go all the way to Walpi. That would be fine, and would give the schoolteacher an interesting experience which wouldn't hurt her in the least. Rosa thought it might be rather interesting than otherwise. She had no compunctions whatever about how Margaret might feel when she arrived in that strange Indian town and found no friends awaiting her. Her only worry was where she was to find a suitable escort, for she felt assured that Margaret would not start out alone with one man servant on an expedition that would keep her out overnight. And where in all that region could she find a woman whom she could trust to send on the errand? It almost looked as though the whole thing were an impossibility. She lay tossing and puzzling over it till gray dawn stole into the room. She mentally reviewed every servant on the place on whom she could rely to do her bidding and keep her secret. But there was some reason why each one would not do. She scanned the country, even considering old Ouida, who had been living in a shack over beyond the fort ever since her cabin had been raided. But old Ouida was too notorious. Mrs. Tanner would keep Margaret from going with her, even if Margaret herself did not know the old woman's reputation. Rosa considered if there were any way of wheedling Mom Wallis into the affair, and gave that up, remembering the suspicious little twinkling eyes of Jasper Kemp. At last she fell asleep, with her plan still unformed, but her determination to carry it through just as strong as ever. If worse came to worse, she would send the half-breed cook from the ranch kitchen and put something in the note about his expecting to meet his sister an hour's ride out on the trail. The half-breed would do anything in the world for money, and Rosa had no trouble in getting all she wanted of that commodity. But the half-breed was an evil-looking fellow, and she feared lest Margaret would not like to go with him. However, he should be a last resort. She would not be balked in her purpose. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 28. Rosa awoke very early, for her sleep had been light and troubled. She dressed hastily and sat down to compose a note which could be altered slightly in case she found someone better than the half-breed. But before she was half through the phrasing, she heard a slight disturbance below her window and a muttering in guttural tones from a strange voice. Glancing hastily out, she saw some Indians below, talking with one of the men, who was shaking his head and motioning to them that they must go on, that this was no place for them to stop. The Indian motioned to his squaw, sitting on a dilapidated little moth-eaten burro with a small papoose in her arms and looking both dirty and miserable. He muttered as though he were pleading for something. "We believe that God's angels follow the feet of little children and needy ones to protect them. Does the devil also send his angels to lead unwary ones astray and to protect the plans of the erring ones? If so, then he must have sent these Indians that morning to further Rosa's plans." And instantly she recognized her opportunity. She leaned out of her window and spoke in a clear, reproving voice. "James, what does he want? Breakfast? You know Father wouldn't want any hungry person to be turned away. Let them sit down on the bench there and tell Dorset I said to give them a good hot breakfast and get some milk for the baby. Be quick about it, too." James started and frowned at the clear, commanding voice. The squaw turned grateful animal eyes up to the little beauty in the window, muttering some inarticulate thanks, while the stolid Indian's eyes glittered hopefully, though the muscles of his mask-like countenance changed not an atom. Rosa smiled radiantly and ran down to see that her orders were obeyed. She tried to talk a little with the squaw, but found she understood very little English. The Indians spoke better and gave her their brief story. They were on their way to the Navajo reservation to the far north. They had been unfortunate enough to lose their last scanty provisions by prowling coyotes during the night and were in need of food. Rosa gave them a place to sit down and a plentiful breakfast, and ordered that a small store of provisions should be prepared for their journey after they had rested. Then she hurried up to her room to finish her letter. She had had her plan well fixed now. These strangers should be her willing messengers. Now and then, as she wrote, she lifted her head and gazed out of the window, where she could see the squaw busy with her little one, and her eyes fairly glittered with satisfaction. Nothing could have been better planned than this. She wrote her note carefully. Dear Margaret. She had heard Hazel call Margaret by her first name, and rightly judged that their new friendship was already strong enough to justify this intimacy. I have found just the opportunity I wanted for you to come to us. These Indians are thoroughly trustworthy and are coming in just the direction to bring you to a point where we will meet you. We have decided to go on to Walpi at once, and will probably meet you near Keams, or a little farther on. The Indian knows the way, and you need not be afraid. I trust him perfectly. Start at once, please, so that you will meet us in time. John has to go on as fast as possible. I know you will enjoy the trip, and am so glad you are coming. Lovingly, Hazel Radcliffe Brownlee. Rosa read it over, comparing it carefully with the little yellow note from her testament, and decided that it was a very good imitation. She could almost hear Mrs. Brownlee saying what she had written. Rosa really was quite clever. She had done it well. She hastily sealed and addressed her letter, and then hurried down to talk with the Indians again. The place she had ordered for them to rest was at some distance from the kitchen door, a sort of outshed for the shelter of certain implements used about the ranch. A long bench ran in front of it, and a big tree made a goodly shade. The Indians had found their temporary camp quite inviting. Rosa made a detour of the shed, satisfied herself that no one was within hearing, and then sat down on the bench, ostensibly playing with the papoose, dangling a red ball on a ribbon before his dazzled bead-like eyes, and bringing forth a gurgle of delight from the dusky little mummy. While she played, she talked idly with the Indians. Had they money enough for their journey? Would they like to earn some? Would they act as a guide to a lady who wanted to go to Walpi? At least she wanted to go as far as Keams, where she might meet friends, missionaries who were going on with her to Walpi to visit the Indians. If they didn't meet her, she wanted to be guided all the way to Walpi. Would they undertake it? It would pay them well. They would get money enough for their journey and have some left when they got to the reservation. And Rosa displayed 2 gold pieces temptingly in her small palms. The Indian uttered a guttural sort of gasp at sight of so much money and sat upright. He gasped again, indicating by a solemn nod that he was agreeable to the task before him, and the girl went gaily on with her instructions. You will have to take some things along to make the lady comfortable. I will see that those are got ready. Then you can have the things for your own when you leave the lady at Walpi. You will have to take a letter to the lady and tell her you are going this afternoon, and she must be ready to start at once or she will not meet the missionary. Tell her you can only wait until 3 o'clock to start. You will find the lady at the schoolhouse at noon. You must not come till noon. Rosa pointed to the sun and then straight overhead. The Indian watched her keenly and nodded. You must ask for Miss Earle and give her this letter. She is the school teacher. The Indian grunted and looked at the white missive in Rosa's hand, noting once more the gleam of the gold pieces. You must wait till the teacher goes to her boarding house and packs her things and eats her dinner. If anybody asks where you came from, you must say the missionary's wife from Ganado sent you. Don't tell anybody anything else. Do you understand? More money if you don't say anything? Rosa clinked the gold pieces softly. The strange sphinx-like gaze of the Indian narrowed comprehensively. He understood. His native cunning was being bought for this girl's own purposes. He looked greedily at the money. Rosa had put her hand in her pocket and brought out yet another gold piece. See, I give you this one now." She laid one gold piece in the Indian's hand. "And these two I put in an envelope and pack with some provisions and blankets on another horse. I will leave the horse tied to a tree up where the big trail crosses this big trail out that way. You know?" Rosa pointed in the direction she meant, and the Indian looked and grunted, his eyes returning to the 2 gold pieces in her hand. It was a great deal of money for the little lady to give. Was she trying to cheat him? He looked down at the gold he already held. It was good money, he was sure of that. He looked at her keenly. "I shall be watching, and I shall know whether you have the lady or not," went on the girl sharply. "If you do not bring the lady with you, there will be no money and no provisions waiting for you. But if you bring the lady, you can untie the horse and take him with you. You will need the horse to carry the things. When you get to Walpi, you can set him free. He is branded, and he will likely come back. We shall find him. See, I will put the gold pieces in this tin can." She picked up a sardine tin that lay at her feet, slipped the gold pieces in an envelope from her pocket, stuffed it in the tin, bent down the cover, and held it up. "This can will be packed on the top of the other provisions, and you can open it and take the money out when you untie the horse. Then hurry on as fast as you can and get as far along the trail as possible tonight before you camp. Do you understand?" The Indian nodded once more, and Rosa felt that she had a confederate worthy of her need. She stayed a few minutes more, going carefully over her directions, telling the Indian to be sure his squaw was kind to the lady, and that on no account he should let the lady get uneasy or have cause to complain of her treatment, or trouble would surely come to him. At last she felt sure she had made him understand, and she hurried away to slip into her pretty white dress and rose-colored ribbons and ride to school. Before she left her room she glanced out of the window at the Indians and saw them sitting motionless like a group of bronze. Once the Indian stirred and, putting his hand in his bosom, drew forth the white letter she had given him, gazed at it a moment, and hid it in his breast again. She nodded her satisfaction as she turned from the window. The next thing was to get to school and play her own part in the commencement exercises. The morning was bright and the schoolhouse was already filled to overflowing when Rosa arrived. Her coming, as always, made a little stir among admiring groups, for even those who feared her admired her from afar. She fluttered into the schoolhouse and up the aisle with the air of a princess who knew she had been waited for and was condescending to come at all. Rosa was in everything, the drills, the march, the choruses, and the crowning oration. She went through it all with the perfection of a bright mind and an adaptable nature. One would never have dreamed, to look at her pretty dimpling face and her sparkling eyes, what diabolical things were moving in her mind, nor how those eyes, lynx soft with lurking sweetness and treachery, were watching all the time furtively for the appearance of the old Indian. At last she saw him, standing in a group just outside the window near the platform, his tall form and stern countenance marking him among the crowd of familiar faces. She was receiving her diploma from the hand of Margaret when she caught his eye, and her hand trembled just a quiver as she took the dainty roll tied with blue and white ribbons. That he recognized her she was sure. That he knew she did not wish him to make known his connection with her she felt equally convinced he understood. His eye had that comprehending look of withdrawal. She did not look up directly at him again. Her eyes were daintily downward. Nevertheless, she missed not a turn of his head, not a glance from that stern eye, and she knew the moment when he stood at the front door of the schoolhouse with the letter in his hand, stolid and indifferent, yet a great force to be reckoned with. Someone looked at the letter, pointed to Margaret, called her, and she came. Rosa was not far away all the time, talking with Jed, her eyes downcast, her cheeks dimpling, missing nothing that could be heard or seen. Margaret read the letter. Rosa watched her, knew every curve of every letter and syllable as she read, held her breath, and watched Margaret's expression. Did she suspect? No. A look of intense relief and pleasure had come into her eyes. She was glad to have found a way to go, She turned to Mrs. Tanner. "What do you think of this, Mrs. Tanner? I'm to go with Mrs. Brownlee on a trip to Walpi. Isn't that delicious? I'm to start at once. Do you suppose I could have a bite to eat? I won't need much. I'm too tired to eat and too anxious to be off. If you give me a cup of tea and a sandwich, I'll be all right. I've got things about ready to go, for Mrs. Brownlee told me she would send someone for me." Said Mrs. Tanner disapprovingly. "Who you going with? Just him? I don't much like his looks." She spoke in a low tone so the Indian would not hear, and it was almost in Rosa's very ear, who stood just behind. Rosa's heart stopped a beat, and she frowned at the toe of her slipper. Was this common little Tanner woman going to be the one to balk her plans? Margaret raised her head now for her first good look at the Indian, and it must be admitted a chill came into her heart. Then, as if he comprehended what was at stake, the Indian turned slightly and pointed down the path toward the road. By common consent, the few who were standing about the door stepped back and made a vista for Margaret to see the squaw, sitting statue-like on her scraggy little pony, gazing off at the mountain in the distance, as if she were sitting for her picture, her solemn little papoose strapped to her back. Margaret's troubled eyes cleared. The family aspect made things all right again. "You see, he has his wife and child," she said. "It's all right. Mrs. Brownlee says she trusts him perfectly, and I'm to meet them on the way. Read the letter." She thrust the letter into Mrs. Tanner's hand, and Rosa trembled for her scheme once more. Surely Mrs. Tanner would not be able to detect the forgery. Well, I suppose it's all right if she says so, but I'm sure I don't relish them pesky Injuns, and I don't think that squaw wife of his looks any great shakes either. They look to me like they needed a good scrub with bristle-brick. But then, if you're set on going, you'll go, course. I just wish Bud hadn't gone home with that Jasper Kemp. He might have gone along, and then you'd have had somebody to speak English to." "Yes, it would have been nice to have William along," said Margaret, "but I think I'll be all right. Mrs. Brownlee wouldn't send anybody that wasn't nice." "I don't know. She's an awful crank. She just loves them Injuns, they say. But I, for one, draw the line at holding 'em in my lap. I don't believe in mixing folks up that way. Preach to 'em if you like, but let 'em keep their distance, I say." Margaret laughed and went off to pick up her things. Rosa stood smiling and talking to Jed until she saw Margaret and Mrs. Tanner go off together, the Indians riding slowly along behind. Rosa waited until the Indians had turned off the road down toward the Tanners, and then she mounted her own pony and rode swiftly home. She rushed up to her room and took off her fine apparel, arraying herself quickly in a plain little gown, and went down to prepare the provisions. There was none too much time, and she must work rapidly. It was well for her plans that she was all-powerful with the servants and could send them about at will to get them out of her way. She invented a duty for each now that would take them for a few minutes well out of sight and sound. Then she hurried to gather the provisions in a basket, making 2 trips to get them to the shelter where she had told the Indian he would find the horse tied. She had to make a 3rd trip to bring the blankets and a few other things she knew would be indispensable. But the whole outfit was really but carelessly gotten together, and it was just by chance that some things got in at all. It was not difficult to find the old cayuse she intended using for a pack horse. He was browsing around in the corral, and she soon had a halter over his head, for she had been quite used to horses from her babyhood. She packed the canned things, tinned meats, vegetables, and fruit into a couple of large sacks, adding some fodder for the horses, a box of matches, some cornbread, of which there was always plenty on hand in the house, some salt pork, and a few tin dishes. These she slung pack fashion over the old horse, fastened the sardine tin containing the gold pieces where it would be easily found, tied the horse to a tree, and retired behind a shelter of sagebrush to watch. It was not long before the little caravan came, the Indians riding ahead single file, like 2 graven images, moving not a muscle of their faces, and Margaret a little way behind on her own pony, her face as happy and relieved as if she were a child let out from a hard task to play. The Indian stopped beside the horse, a glitter of satisfaction in his eyes as he saw that the little lady had fulfilled her part of the bargain. He indicated to the squaw and the lady that they might move on down the trail and he would catch up with them, and then dismounted, pouncing warily upon the sardine tin at once. He looked furtively about, then took out the money and tested it with his teeth to make sure it was genuine. He grunted his further satisfaction, looked over the pack horse, made more secure the fastenings of the load, and, taking the halter, mounted and rode stolidly away toward the north. Rosa waited in her covert until they were far out of sight, then made her way hurriedly back to the house and climbed to a window where she could watch the trail for several miles. There, with a field glass, she kept watch until the procession had filed across the plains, down into a valley, up over a hill, and dropped to a farther valley out of sight. She looked at the sun and drew a breath of satisfaction. She had done it at last. She had got Margaret away before Forsythe came. There was no likelihood that the fraud would be discovered until her rival was far enough away to be safe. A kind of reaction came upon Rosa's overwrought nerves. She laughed out harshly, and her voice had a cruel ring to it. Then she threw herself upon the bed and burst into a passionate fit of weeping, and so, by and by, fell asleep. She dreamed that Margaret had returned like a shining, fiery angel, a two-edged sword in her hand, and all the Wallace camp at her heels, with vengeance in their wake. That hateful little boy, Bud Tanner, danced around and made faces at her, while Forsythe had forgotten her to gaze at Margaret's face. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 29. To Margaret the day was very fair and the omens all auspicious. She carried with her close to her heart 2 precious letters received that morning and scarcely glanced at as yet, one from Gardley and one from her mother. She had had only time to open them and be sure that all was well with her dear ones, and had left the rest to read on the way. She was dressed in the khaki riding habit she always wore when she went on horseback, and in the bag strapped on behind she carried a couple of fresh white blouses, a thin white dress, a little soft dark silk gown that folded away almost into a cobweb, and a few other necessities. She had also slipped in a new book her mother had sent her, into which she had had as yet no time to look, and her chessmen and board, besides writing materials. She prided herself on having got so many necessaries into so small a compass. She would need the extra clothing if she stayed at Ganado with the missionaries for a week on her return from the trip, and the book and the chessmen would amuse them all by the way. She had heard Brownlee say he loved to play chess. Margaret rode on the familiar trail, and for the first hour just let herself be glad that school was over and she could rest and have no responsibility. The sun shimmered down brilliantly on the white hot sand and gray-green of the greasewood and sagebrush. Tall spikes of cactus like lonely spires shot up now and again to vary the scene. It was all familiar ground to Margaret around here, for she had taken many rides with Gardley and Bud, and for the first part of the way every turn and bit of view was fraught with pleasant memories that brought a smile to her eyes as she recalled some quotation of Gardley's or some prank of Bud's. Here was where they first sighted the little cottontail the day she took her initial ride on her own pony. Off there was the mountain where they saw the sun drawing silver water above a frowning storm. Yonder was the group of cedars where they had stopped to eat their lunch once, and this water hole they were approaching was the one where Gardley had given her a drink from his hat. She was almost glad that Bud was not along, for she was too tired to talk and liked to be alone with her thoughts for this few minutes. Poor Bud! He would be disappointed when he got back to find her gone, but then he had expected she was going in a few days, anyway, and she had promised to take long rides with him when she returned. She had left a little note for him, asking him to read a certain book in her bookcase while she was gone and be ready to discuss it with her when she got back. And Bud would be fascinated with it, she knew. Bud had been dear and faithful, and she would miss him, but just for this little while she was glad to have the great out-of-doors to herself. She was practically alone. The two sphinx-like figures riding ahead of her made no sign, but stolidly rode on hour after hour, nor turned their heads even to see if she were coming. She knew that Indians were this way. Still, as the time went by, she began to feel an uneasy sense of being alone in the universe with a couple of bronze statues. Even the papoose had erased itself in sleep, and when it awoke partook so fully of its racial peculiarities as to hold its little peace and make no fuss. Margaret began to feel the baby was hardly human, more like a little brown doll set up in a missionary meeting to teach white children what a papoose was like. By and by she got out her letters and read them over carefully, dreaming and smiling over them and getting precious bits by heart. Gardley hinted that he might be able very soon to visit her parents, as it looked as though he might have to make a trip on business in their direction before he could go further with what he was doing in his old home. He gave no hint of soon returning to the West. He said he was awaiting the return of one man who might soon be coming from abroad. Margaret sighed and wondered how many weary months it would be before she would see him. Perhaps, after all, she ought to have gone home and stayed them out with her mother and father, if the school board could be made to see that it would be better to have no summer session. Perhaps she would even yet go when she returned from the Brownleighs. She would see. She would decide nothing until she was rested. Suddenly she felt herself overwhelmingly weary and wished that the Indians would stop and rest for a while. But when she stirred up her sleepy pony and spurred ahead to broach the matter to her guide, he shook his solemn head and pointed to the sun. "No get Keam's good time. No meet Anishudi." Anishudi, she knew, was the Indian's name for the missionary, and she smiled her acquiescence. Of course, they must meet the Brownleighs and not detain them. What was it Hazel had said about having to hurry? She searched her pocket for the letter and then remembered she had left it with Mrs. Tanner. What a pity she had not brought it. Perhaps there was some caution or advice in it that she had not taken note of. But then the Indian likely knew all about it, and she could trust to him. She glanced at his stolid face and wished she could make him smile. She cast a sunny smile at him and said something pleasant about the beautiful day, but he only looked her through as if she were not there, and after one or two more attempts she fell back and tried to talk to the squaw, but the squaw only looked stolid too and shook her head. She did not seem friendly. Margaret drew back into her old position and feasted her eyes upon the distant hills. The road was growing unfamiliar now. They were crossing rough ridges with cliffs of red sandstone, and every step of the way was interesting. Yet Margaret felt more and more how much she wanted to lie down and sleep. And when at last in the dusk the Indians halted not far from a little pool of rainwater and indicated that here they would camp for the night, Margaret was too weary to question the decision. It had not occurred to her that she would be on the way overnight before she met her friends. Her knowledge of the way and of distances was but vague. It is doubtful if she would have ventured had she known that she must pass the night thus in the company of two strange, savage creatures. Yet, now that she was here and it was inevitable, she would not shrink, but make the best of it. She tried to be friendly once more and offered to look out for the baby while the squaw gathered wood and made a fire. The Indian was off looking after the horses, evidently expecting his wife to do all the work. Margaret watched a few minutes while pretending to play with the baby, who was both sleepy and hungry, yet held his emotions as stolidly as if he were a grown person. Then she decided to take a hand in the supper. She was hungry and could not bear that those dusky, dirty hands should set forth her food. So she went to work cheerfully, giving directions as if the Indian woman understood her, though she very soon discovered that all her talk was as mere babbling to the other, and she might as well hold her peace. The woman set a kettle of water over the fire, and Margaret forestalled her next movement by cutting some pork and putting it to cook in a little skillet she found among the provisions. The woman watched her solemnly, not seeming to care, and so, silently, each went about her own preparations. The supper was a silent affair, and when it was over the squaw handed Margaret a blanket. Suddenly she understood that this, and this alone, was to be her bed for the night. The earth was there for a mattress, and the sage brush lent a partial shelter. The canopy of stars was overhead. A kind of panic took possession of her. She stared at the squaw and found herself longing to cry out for help. It seemed as if she could not bear this awful silence of the mortals who were her only company. Yet her common sense came to her aid, and she realized that there was nothing for it but to make the best of things. So she took the blanket and, spreading it out, sat down upon it and wrapped it about her shoulders and feet. She would not lie down until she saw what the rest did. Somehow she shrank from asking the bronze man how to fold a blanket for a bed on the ground. She tried to remember what Gardley had told her about folding the blanket bed so as best to keep out snakes and ants. She shuddered at the thought of snakes. Would she dare call for help from those stolid companions of hers if a snake should attempt to molest her in the night? And would she ever dare to go to sleep? She remembered her first night in Arizona out among the stars, alone on the water tank, and her first frenzy of loneliness. Was this as bad? No, for these Indians were trustworthy and well known by her dear friends. It might be unpleasant, but this too would pass, and the morrow would soon be here. The dusk dropped down and the stars loomed out. All the world grew wonderful, like a blue jeweled dome of a palace with the lights turned low. The fire burned brightly as the man threw sticks upon it, and the two Indians moved stealthily about in the darkness, passing silhouetted before the fire this way and that, and then at last lying down, wrapped in their blankets to sleep. It was very quiet about her. The air was so still she could hear the hobbled horses munching away in the distance, and moving now and then with the halting gait a hobble gives a horse. Off in the farther distance the blood-curdling howl of the coyotes rose, but Margaret was used to them and knew they would not come near a fire. She was growing very weary, and at last wrapped the blanket closer and lay down, her head pillowed on one corner of it. Committing herself to her Heavenly Father and breathing a prayer for father, mother, and lover, she fell asleep. It was still almost dark when she awoke. For a moment she thought it was still night and the sunset was not gone yet. The clouds were so rosy tinted. The squaw was standing by her, touching her shoulder roughly and grunting something. She perceived, as she rubbed her eyes and tried to summon back her senses, that she was expected to get up and eat breakfast. There was a smell of pork and coffee in the air, and there was scorched cornbread beside the fire on a pan. Margaret got up quickly and ran down to the water hole to get some water, dashing it in her face and over her arms and hands. The squaw, meanwhile, standing at a little distance, watching her curiously, as if she thought this some kind of an oblation paid to the white woman's God before she ate. Margaret pulled the hairpins out of her hair, letting it down and combing it with one side of her side combs, twisted it up again in its soft, fluffy waves, straightened her collar, set on her hat, and was ready for the day. The squaw looked at her with both awe and contempt for a moment, then turned and stalked back to her papoose and began preparing it for the journey. Margaret made a hurried meal and was scarcely done before she found her guides were waiting like two pillars of the desert, but watching keenly, impatiently, her every mouthful and anxious to be off. The sky was still pink-tinted with the semblance of a sunset, and Margaret felt, as she mounted her pony and followed her companions, as if the day was all turned upside down. She almost wondered whether she hadn't slept through a whole 24 hours, and it were not, after all, evening again, till by and by the sun rose clear and the wonder of the cloud tinting melted into day. The road lay through a sagebrush and old barren cedar trees, with rabbits darting now and then between the rocks. Suddenly, from the top of a little hill, they came out to a spot where they could see far over the desert. 40 miles away, 3 square flat hills, or mesas, looked like a gigantic train of cars, and the clear air gave everything a strange vastness. Farther on beyond the mesas dimly dawned the black mountains. One could even see the shadowed head of Round Rock, almost 100 miles away. Before them and around was a great plain of sagebrush, and here and there was a small bush that the Indians call the weed that was not scared. Margaret had learned all these things during her winter in Arizona, and keenly enjoyed the vast, splendid view spread before her. They passed several little mud-plastered hogans that Margaret knew for Indian dwellings. A fine band of ponies off in the distance made an interesting spot on the landscape, and twice they passed bands of sheep. She had a feeling of great isolation from everything she had ever known, and seemed going farther and farther from life and all she loved. Once she ventured to ask the Indian what time he expected to meet her friends, the missionaries, but he only shook his head and murmured something unintelligible about Keams and pointed to the sun. She dropped behind again, vaguely uneasy. She could not tell why. There seemed something so altogether sly and wary and unfriendly in the faces of the two that she almost wished she had not come. Yet the way was beautiful enough, and nothing very unpleasant was happening to her. Once she dropped the envelope of her mother's letter and was about to dismount and recover it. Then some strange impulse made her leave it on the sand of the desert. What if they should be lost and that paper should guide them back? The notion stayed by her, and once in a while she dropped other bits of paper by the way. About noon the trail dropped off into a cañon, with high yellow rock walls on either side and stifling heat, so that she felt as if she could scarcely stand it. She was glad when they emerged once more and climbed to higher ground. The noon camp was a hasty affair, for the Indian seemed in a hurry. He scanned the horizon far and wide and seemed searching keenly for someone or something. Once they met a lonely Indian, and he held a muttered conversation with him, pointing off ahead and gesticulating angrily, but the words were unintelligible to Margaret. Her feeling of uneasiness was growing, and yet she could not for the life of her tell why, and laid it down to her tired nerves. She was beginning to think she had been very foolish to start on such a long trip before she had had a chance to get rested from her last days of school. She longed to lie down under a tree and sleep for days. Toward night they sighted a great blue mesa about 50 miles south, and at sunset they could just see the San Francisco peaks more than 125 miles away. Margaret, as she stopped her horse and gazed, felt a choking in her heart and throat and a great desire to cry. The glory and awe of the mountains, mingled with her own weariness and nervous fear, were almost too much for her. She was glad to get down and eat a little supper and go to sleep again. As she fell asleep she comforted herself with repeating over a few precious words from her Bible. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me to dwell in safety. The voice of the coyotes, now far, now near, boomed out on the night. Great stars shot dartingly pathways across the heavens. The fire snapped and crackled, died down, and flickered feebly. But Margaret slept, tired out, and dreamed the angels kept close vigil about her lowly couch. She did not know what time the stars disappeared and the rain began to fall. She was too tired to notice the drops that fell upon her face, too tired to hear the coyotes coming nearer, nearer. Yet in the morning there lay one dead, stretched not 30 feet from where she lay. The Indian had shot him through the heart. Somehow things looked very dismal that morning. In spite of the brightness of the sun after the rain, She was stiff and sore with lying in the dampness. Her hair was wet, her blanket was wet, and she woke without feeling rested. Almost the trip seemed more than she could bear. If she could have wished herself back that morning and have stayed at Tanner's all summer, she certainly would have done it rather than to be where and how she was. The Indian seemed excited, the man grim and forbidding, the woman appealing, frightened, anxious. They were near to Keams Cañon. Anishati would be somewhere about. The Indian hoped to be rid of his burden then and travel on his interrupted journey. He was growing impatient. He felt he had earned his money. But when they tried to go down Keams Cañon, they found the road all washed away by flood and must needs go a long way around. This made the Indian surly. His countenance was more forbidding than ever. Margaret, as she watched him with sinking heart, altered her ideas of the Indian as a whole to suit the situation. She had always felt pity for the poor Indian whose land had been seized and whose kindred had been slaughtered. But this Indian was not an object of pity. He was the most disagreeable, cruel-looking Indian Margaret had ever laid eyes on. She had felt it innately the first time she saw him, but now, as the situation began to bring him out, she knew that she was dreadfully afraid of him. She had a feeling that he might scalp her if he got tired of her. She began to alter her opinion of Hazel Brownleigh's judgment as regarded Indians. She did not feel that she would ever send this Indian to any one for a guide and say he was perfectly trustworthy. He hadn't done anything very dreadful yet, but she felt he was going to. He had a number of angry confabs with his wife that morning. At least he did the confabbing and the squaw protested. Margaret gathered after a while that it was something about herself. The furtive, frightened glances that the squaw cast in her direction sometimes when the man was not looking made her think so. She tried to say it was all imagination and that her nerves were getting the upper hand of her. But in spite of her, she shuddered sometimes, just as she had done when Rosa looked at her. She decided that she must be going to have a fit of sickness and that just as soon as she got in the neighborhood of Mrs. Tanner's again, she would pack her trunk and go home to her mother. If she was going to be sick, she wanted her mother. About noon, things came to a climax. They halted on the top of the mesa and the Indians had another altercation, which ended in the man descending the trail a fearfully steep way, down 400 feet to the trading post in the cañon. Margaret looked down and gasped and thanked a kind Providence that had not made it necessary for her to make that descent. But the squaw stood at the top with her baby and looked down in silent sorrow. Agony, perhaps, would be a better name. Her face was terrible to look upon. Margaret could not understand it, and she went to the woman and put her hand out sympathetically, asking gently, "What is the matter, you poor little thing? Oh, what is it?" Perhaps the woman understood the tenderness in the tone, for she suddenly turned and rested her forehead against Margaret's shoulder, giving one great gasping sob, then lifted her dry, miserable eyes to the girl's face as if to thank her for her kindness. Margaret's heart was touched. She threw her arms around the poor woman and drew her papoose and all comfortingly toward her, patting her shoulder and saying gentle, soothing words as she would to a little child. And by the woman lifted her head again, the tears coursing down her face, and tried to explain, muttering her queer gutturals and making eloquent gestures until Margaret felt she understood. She gathered that the man had gone down to the trading post to find the Anishati, and that the squaw feared that he would somehow procure fire water either from the trader or from some Indian he might meet, and would come back angrier than he had gone, and without his money. If Margaret also suspected that the Indian had desired to get rid of her by leaving her at that desolate little trading station down in the cañon until such time as her friends should call for her, she resolutely put the thought out of her mind and set herself to cheer the poor Indian woman. She took a bright, soft, rosy silk tie from her own neck and knotted it about the astonished woman's dusky throat, and then she put a silver dollar in her hand and was thrilled with wonder to see what a change came over the poor dark face. It reminded her of Mom Wallis when she got on her new bonnet and once again she felt the thrill of knowing the whole world kin. The squaw cheered up after a little, got sticks and made a fire, and together they had quite a pleasant meal. Margaret exerted herself to make the poor woman laugh, and finally succeeded by dangling a bright red knight from her chessman in front of the delighted baby's eyes till he gurgled out a real baby crow of joy. It was the middle of the afternoon before the Indian returned, sitting crazily his struggling beast as he climbed the trail once more. Margaret, watching, caught her breath and prayed. Was this the trustworthy man? This drunken, reeling creature, clubbing his horse and pouring forth a torrent of indistinguishable gutturals? It was evident that his wife's worst fears were verified. He had found the firewater. The frightened squaw set to work putting things together as fast as she could. She well knew what to expect, and when the man reached the top of the mesa he found his party packed and mounted, waiting fearsomely to take the trail. Silently, timorously, they rode behind him, west across the great wide plain. In the distance, gradually there appeared dim mesas like great fingers stretching out against the sky. Miles away they seemed, and nothing intervening but a stretch of varying color where sagebrush melted into sand, and sagebrush and greasewood grew again, with tall cactus startling here and there like bayonets at rest, but bristling with menace. The Indian had grown silent and sullen. His eyes were like deep fires of burning volcanoes. One shrank from looking at them. His massive, cruel profile stood out like bronze against the evening sky. It was growing night again, and still they had not come to anywhere or anything, and still her friends seemed just as far away. Since they had left the top of Keams Cañon, Margaret had been sure all was not right. Aside from the fact that the guide was drunk at present, she was convinced that there had been something wrong with him all along. He did not act like the Indians around Ashland. He did not act like a trusted guide that her friends would send for her. She wished once more that she had kept Hazel Brownleigh's letter. She wondered how her friends would find her if they came after her. It was then she began in earnestly to systematically plan to leave a trail behind her all the rest of the way. If she had only done it thoroughly when she first began to be uneasy. But now she was so far away, so many miles from anywhere. Oh, if she had not come at all! At first she dropped her handkerchief because she happened to have it in her hand, a dainty thing with lace on the edge and her name written in tiny script by her mother's careful hand on the narrow hem. And then, after a little, as soon as she could scrawl it without being noticed, she wrote a note which she twisted around the neck of a red chessman and left behind her. After that, scraps of paper, as she could reach them out of the bag tied on behind her saddle, then a stocking, a bedroom slipper, more chessmen, and so, when they halted at dusk and prepared to strike camp, she had quite a good little trail blazed behind her over that wide, empty plain. She shuddered as she looked into the gathering darkness ahead, where those long, dark lines of mesas looked like barriers in the way. Then suddenly the Indian pointed ahead to the first mesa and uttered one word, Walpi. So that was the Indian village to which she was bound? What was before her on the morrow? After eating a pretense of supper, she lay down. The Indian had more firewater with him. He drank. He uttered cruel gutturals at his squaw, and even kicked the feet of the sleeping papoose as he passed by till it awoke and cried sharply, which made him more angry, so he struck the squaw. It seemed hours before all was quiet. Margaret's nerves were strained to such a pitch she scarcely dared to breathe. But at last, when the fire had almost died down, the man lay quiet, and she could relax and close her eyes. Not to sleep. She must not go to sleep. The fire was almost gone, and the coyotes would be around. She must wake and watch. That was the last thought she remembered. That and a prayer that the angels would keep watch once again. When she awoke, it was broad daylight and far into the morning, for the sun was high overhead and the mesas in the distance were clear and distinct against the sky. She sat up and looked about her, bewildered, not knowing at first where she was. It was so still and wide and lonely. She turned to find the Indians, but there was no trace of them anywhere. The fire lay smoldering in its place, a thin trickle of smoke curling away from a dying stick. But that was all. A tin cup half full of coffee was beside the stick, and a piece of blackened cornbread. She turned frightened eyes to east, to west, to north, to south, but there was no one in sight, and out over the distant mesa there poised a great eagle, alone in the vast sky, keeping watch over the brilliant, silent waste. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 30. When Margaret was a very little girl, her father and mother had left her alone for an hour with a stranger while they went out to make a call in a strange city through which they were passing on a summer trip. The stranger was kind and gave to the child a large green box of bits of old black lace and purple ribbons to play with, but she turned sorrowfully from the somber array of finery, which was the only thing in the way of a plaything the woman had at hand, and stood looking drearily out of the window on the strange new town, a feeling of utter loneliness upon her. Her little heart was almost choked with the awfulness of the thought that she was a human atom drifted apart from every other atom she had ever known, that she had a personality and a responsibility of her own, and that she must face this thought of herself and her aloneness forevermore. It was the child's first realization that she was a separate being apart from her father and mother, and she was almost consumed with the terror of it. As she rose now from her bed on the ground and looked out across that vast waste in which the only other living creature was that sinister, watching eagle, the same feeling returned to her and made her tremble like the little child who had turned from her box of ancient finery to realize her own little self and its terrible aloneness. For an instant even her realization of God, which had from early childhood been present with her, seemed to have departed. She could not grasp anything save the vast, empty silence that loomed about her so awfully. She was alone, and about as far from anywhere or anything as she could possibly be in the state of Arizona. Would she ever get back to human habitations? Would her friends ever be able to find her? Then her heart flew back to its habitual refuge, and she spoke aloud and said, "God is here." And the thought seemed to comfort her. She looked about once more on the bright waste, and now it did not seem so dreary. "God is here," she repeated, and tried to realize that this was a part of His habitation. She could not be lost where God was. He knew the way out. She had only to trust. So she dropped upon her knees in the sand and prayed for trust and courage. When she rose again, she walked steadily to a height a little above the camp fire, and, shading her eyes, looked carefully in every direction. No, there was not a sign of her recent companions. They must have stolen away in the night quite soon after she fell asleep, and have gone fast and far, so that they were now beyond the reach of her eyes, and not anywhere was there sign of living thing, save that eagle still sweeping in great curves and poising again above the distant mesa. Where was her horse? Had the Indians taken that too? She searched the valley, but saw no horse at first. With sinking heart she went back to where her things were and sat down by the dying fire to think, putting a few loose twigs and sticks together to keep the embers bright while she could. She reflected that she had no matches, and this was probably the last fire she would have until somebody came to her rescue or she got somewhere by herself. What was she to do? Stay right where she was or start out on foot? And should she go backward or forward? Surely the Brownleighs would miss her pretty soon and send out a search party for her. How could it be that they trusted an Indian who had done such a cruel thing as to leave a woman unprotected in the desert? And yet, perhaps they did not know his temptation to drink. Perhaps they had thought he could not get any fire water. Perhaps he would return when he came to himself and realized what he had done. And now she noticed what she had not seen at first, a small bottle of water on a stone beside the blackened bread. Realizing that she was very hungry and that this was the only food at hand, she sat down beside the fire to eat the dry bread and drink the miserable coffee. She must have strength to do whatever was before her. She tried not to think how her mother would feel if she never came back, how anxious they would be as they waited day by day for her letters that did not come. She reflected with a sinking heart that she had, just before leaving, written a hasty note to her mother telling her not to expect anything for several days, perhaps even as much as 2 weeks, as she was going out of civilization for a little while. How had she unwittingly sealed her fate by that? For now, not even by way of her alarmed home could help come to her. She put the last bit of hard cornbread in her pocket for a further time of need, and began to look about her again. Then she spied with delight a moving object far below her in the valley, and decided it was a horse, perhaps her own. He was a mile away at least, but he was there, and she cried out with sudden joy and relief. She went over to her blanket and bags, which had been beside her during the night, and stood a moment trying to think what to do. Should she carry the things to the horse, or risk leaving them here while she went after the horse and brought him to the things? No, that would not be safe. Some one might come along and take them, or she might not be able to find her way back again in this strange, wild waste. Besides, she might not get the horse, after all, and would lose everything. She must carry her things to the horse. She stooped to gather them up, and something bright beside her bag attracted her. It was the sun shining on the silver dollar she had given to the Indian woman. A sudden rush of tears came to her eyes. The poor creature had tried to make all the reparation she could for thus hastily leaving the white woman in the desert. She had given back the money, all she had that was valuable. Beside the dollar rippled a little chain of beads, curiously wrought, an inanimate appeal for forgiveness, and a grateful return for the kindness shown her. Margaret smiled as she stooped again to pick up her things. There had been a heart, after all, behind that stolid countenance, and some sense of righteousness and justice. Margaret decided that Indians were not all treacherous. Poor woman! What a life was hers! To follow her grim lord whither he would lead, even as her white sister must sometimes, sorrowing, rebelling, crying out, but following. She wondered if into the heart of this dark sister there ever crept any of the rebellion which led some of her white sisters to cry aloud for rights and emancipation. But it was all a passing thought to be remembered and turned over at a more propitious time. Margaret's whole thoughts now were bent on her present predicament. The packing was short work. She stuffed everything into the 2 bags that were usually hung across the horse and settled them carefully across her shoulders. Then she rolled the blanket, took it in her arms, and started. It was a heavy burden to carry, but she could not make up her mind to part with any of her things until she had at least made an effort to save them. If she should be left alone in the desert for the night, the blanket was indispensable, and her clothes would at least do to drop as a trail by which her friends might find her. She must carry them as far as possible. So she started. It was already high day and the sun was intolerably hot. Her heavy burden was not only cumbersome, but very warm, and she felt her strength going from her as she went. But her nerve was up and her courage was strong. Moreover, she prayed as she walked, and she felt now the presence of her guide and was not afraid. As she walked, she faced a number of possibilities in the immediate future which were startling and, to say the least, undesirable. There were wild animals in this land, not so much in the daylight, but what of the night? She had heard that a woman was always safe in that wild Western land. But what of the prowling Indians? What of a possible exception to the Western rule of chivalry toward a decent woman? One small piece of cornbread and less than a pint of water were small provision on which to withstand a siege. How far was it to anywhere? It was then she remembered for the first time that one word, Walpi, uttered by the Indian as he came to a halt the night before and pointed far to the mesa. Walpi. She lifted her eyes now and scanned the dark mesa. It looked like a great battlement of rock against the sky. Could it be possible there were people dwelling there? She had heard, of course, about the curious Hopi villages, each village a gigantic house of many rooms, called pueblos, built upon the lofty crags, sometimes 500 or 600 feet above the desert. Could it be that great castle-looking outline against the sky before her, standing out on the end of the mesa like a promontory above the sea, was Walpi? And if it was, how was she to get up there? The rock rose sheer and steep from the desert floor. The narrow neck of land behind it looked like a slender thread. Her heart sank at thought of trying to storm and enter, single-handed, such an impregnable fortress. And yet, if her friends were there, perhaps they would see her when she drew near and come to show her the way. Strange that they should have gone on and left her with those treacherous Indians. Strange that they should have trusted them so in the first place. Her own instincts had been against trusting the man from the beginning. It must be confessed that during her reflections at this point her opinion of the wisdom and judgment of the Brownleighs was lowered several notches. Then she began to berate herself for having so easily been satisfied about her escort. She should have read the letter more carefully. She should have asked the Indians more questions. She should perhaps have asked Jasper Kemp's advice or got him to talk to the Indian. She wished with all her heart for Bud now. If Bud were along, he would be saying some comical boy thing and be finding a way out of the difficulty. Dear, faithful Bud. The sun rose higher and the morning grew hotter. As she descended to the valley, her burdens grew intolerable, and several times she almost cast them aside. Once she lost sight of her pony among the sagebrush, and it was 2 hours before she came to him and was able to capture him and strap on her burdens. She was almost too exhausted to climb into the saddle when all was ready, but she managed to mount at last and started out toward the ragged crag ahead of her. The pony had a long, hot climb out of the valley to a hill where she could see very far again, but still that vast emptiness reigned. Even the eagle had disappeared, and she fancied he must be resting like a great emblem of freedom on one of the points of the castle-like battlement against the sky. It seemed as if the end of the world had come, and she was the only one left in the universe, forgotten, riding on her weary horse across an endless desert in search of a home she would never see again. Below the hill there stretched a wide, white strip of sand, perhaps 2 miles in extent, but shimmering in the sun and seeming to recede ahead of her as she advanced. Beyond was soft greenness, something growing, not near enough to be discerned as cornfields. The girl drooped her tired head upon her horse's mane and wept, her courage going from her with her tears. In all that wide universe there seemed no way to go, and she was so very tired, hungry, hot, and discouraged. There was always that bit of bread in her pocket and that muddy-looking warm water for a last resort, but she must save them as long as possible, for there was no telling how long it would be before she had more. There was no trail now to follow. She had started from the spot where she had found the horse, and her inexperienced eyes could not have searched out a trail if she had tried. She was going toward that distant castle on the crag as to a goal. But when she reached it, if she ever did, would she find anything there but crags and lonesomeness and the eagle? Drying her tears at last, she started the horse on down the hill, and perhaps her tears blinded her, or because she was dizzy with hunger and the long stretch of anxiety and fatigue she was not looking closely. There was a steep place a sharp falling away of the ground unexpectedly as they emerged from a thicket of sagebrush, and the horse plunged several feet down, striking sharply on some loose rocks and slipping to his knees, snorting, scrambling, making brave effort, but slipping, half rolling. At last he was brought down with his frightened rider and lay upon his side with her foot under him and a sensation like a red-hot knife running through her ankle. Margaret caught her breath in quick gasps as they fell, lifting a prayer in her heart for help. Then came the crash and the sharp pain, and with the quick conviction that all was over she dropped back unconscious on the sand, a blessed oblivion of darkness rushing over her. When she came to herself once more, the hot sun was pouring down upon her unprotected face, and she was conscious of intense pain and suffering in every part of her body. She opened her eyes wildly and looked around. There was sagebrush up above, waving over the crag down which they had fallen, its gray greenness shimmering hotly in the sun. The sky was mercilessly blue, without a cloud. The great beast, heaving and quivering, lay solidly against her, half pinning her to earth, and the helplessness of her position was like an awful nightmare from which she felt she might waken if she could only cry out. But when at last she raised her voice, its empty echo frightened her, and there, above her, with wide-spread wings, circling for an instant, then poised in motionless survey of her, with cruel eyes upon her, loomed that eagle, so large, so fearful, so suggestive in its curious stare, the monarch of the desert, come to see who had invaded his precincts and fallen into one of his snares. With sudden frenzy burning in her veins, Margaret struggled and tried to get free, but she could only move the slightest bit each time, and every motion was an agony to the hurt ankle. It seemed hours before she writhed herself free from that great motionless horse, whose labored breath only showed that he was still alive. Something terrible must have happened to the horse, or he would have tried to rise, for she had coaxed, patted, cajoled, tried in every way to rouse him. When at last she crawled free from that hot, horrible body and crept with pained progress around in front of him, she saw that both his forelegs lay limp and helpless. He must have broken them in falling. Poor fellow! He too was suffering, and she had nothing to give him. There was nothing she could do for him. Then she thought of the bottle of water, but, searching for it, found that her good intention of dividing it with him was useless, for the bottle was broken and the water already soaked into the sand. Only a damp spot on the saddlebag showed where it had departed. Then indeed did Margaret sink down in the sand in despair and begin to pray as she had never prayed before. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 31. The morning after Margaret's departure, Rosa awoke with no feelings of self-reproach, but rather a great exultation at the way in which she had been able to get rid of her rival. She lay for a few minutes thinking of Forsythe and trying to decide what she would wear when she went forth to meet him, for she wanted to charm him as she had never charmed any one before. She spent some time arraying herself in different costumes, but at last decided on her commencement gown of fine white organdie, hand-embroidered and frilly with filmy lace, the product of a famous house of gowns in the Eastern city where she had attended school for a while and acquired expensive tastes. Daintily slippered, beribboned with coral silk girdle, and with a rose from the vine over her window in her hair, she sallied forth at last to the trysting place. Forsythe was a whole hour late, as became a languid gentleman who had traveled the day before and idled at his sister's house over a late breakfast until nearly noon. Already his fluttering fancy was apathetic about Rosa, and he wondered, as he rode along, What had become of the interesting young teacher who had charmed him for more than a passing moment? Would he dare to call upon her now that Gardley was out of the way? Was she still in Ashland or had she gone home for vacation? He must ask Rosa about her. Then he came in sight of Rosa, sitting picturesquely in the shade of an old cedar, reading poetry, a little lady in the wilderness, and he forgot everything else in his delight over the change in her. For Rosa had changed. There was no mistake about it. She had bloomed out into maturity in those few short months of his absence. Her soft figure had rounded and developed. Her bewitching curls were put up on her head, with only a stray tendril here and there to emphasize a dainty ear or call attention to a smooth, round neck. And when she raised her lovely head and lifted limpid eyes to his, there was about her a demureness, a coolness, and charm that he had fancied only ladies of the city could attain. Oh, Rosa knew her charms, and had practiced many a day before her mirror till she had appraised the value of every curving eyelash, every hidden dimple, every Cupid's curve of lip. Rosa had watched well and learned from all with whom she had come in contact. No woman's guile was left untried by her. And Rosa was very sweet and charming. She knew just when to lift up innocent eyes of wonder, when to not understand suggestions, when to exclaim softly with delight or shrink with shyness that nevertheless did not repulse. Forsythe studied her with wonder and delight. No maiden of the city had ever charmed him more, and withal she seemed so innocent and young, so altogether pliable in his hands. His pulses beat high, his heart was inflamed, and passion came and sat within his handsome eyes. It was easy to persuade her, after her first seemingly shy reserve was overcome, and before an hour was past she had promised to go away with him. He had very little money, but what of that? When he spoke of that feature, Rosa declared she could easily get some. Her father gave her free access to his safe and kept her plentifully supplied for the household use. It was nothing to her, a passing incident. What should it matter whose money took them on their way? When she went demurely back to the ranch a little before sunset, she thought she was very happy. Poor little silly sinner! She met her father with her most alluring but most furtive smile. She was charming at supper and blushed as her mother used to do when he praised her new gown and told her how well she looked in it. But she professed to be weary, yet from the last days of school, to have a headache, and so she went early to her room and asked that the servants keep the house quiet in the morning, that she might sleep late and get really rested. Her father kissed her tenderly and thought what a dear child she was and what a comfort to his ripening years, and the house settled down into quiet. Rosa packed a bag with some of her most elaborate garments, arrayed herself in a charming little outfit of silk for the journey, dropped her baggage out of the window, and when the moon rose and the household were quietly sleeping, she paid a visit to her father's safe and then stole forth, taking her shadowy way to the trail by a winding route known well to herself and secure from the watch of vigilant servants who were ever on the lookout for cattle thieves. Thus she left her father's house and went forth to put her trust in a man whose promises were as ropes of sand and whose fancy was like a wave of the sea, tossed to and fro by every breath that blew. Long ere the sun rose the next morning, the guarded, beloved child was as far from her safe home and her father's sheltering love as if alone she had started for the mouth of the bottomless pit. 2 days later, while Margaret lay unconscious beneath the sagebrush with a hovering eagle for watch, Rosa, in the streets of a great city, suddenly realized that she was more alone in the universe than ever she could have been in a wide desert, and her plight was far worse than the girl's with whose fate she had so lightly played. Quite early on the morning after Rosa left, while the household was still keeping quiet for the supposed sleeper, Gardley rode into the enclosure about the house and asked for Rogers. Gardley had been traveling night and day to get back. Matters had suddenly arranged themselves so that he could finish up his business at his old home and go on to see Margaret's father and mother, and he had made his visit there and hurried back to Arizona, hoping to reach Ashland in time for commencement. A delay on account of a washout on the road had brought him back 2 days late for commencement. He had ridden to camp from a junction 40 miles away to get there the sooner, and this morning had ridden straight to the Tanners to surprise Margaret. It was, therefore, a deep disappointment to find her gone, and only Mrs. Tanner's voluble explanations for comfort. Mrs. Tanner exhausted her vocabulary in trying to describe the Injuns, her own feeling of protest against them, and Mrs. Brownleigh's foolishness in making so much of them. And then she bustled into the old pine desk in the dining room and produced the letter that had started Margaret off as soon as commencement was over. Gardley took the letter eagerly, as though it were something to connect him with Margaret, and read it through carefully to make sure just how matters stood. He had looked troubled when Mrs. Tanner told how tired Margaret was and how worried she seemed about her school and glad to get away from it all, and he agreed that the trip was probably a good thing. "I wish Bud could have gone along, though," he said thoughtfully as he turned away from the door. "I don't like her to go with just Indians, though I suppose it is all right. You say he had his wife and child along? Of course Mrs. Brownleigh wouldn't send anybody that wasn't perfectly all right. Well, I suppose the trip will be a rest for her. I'm sorry I didn't get home a few days sooner. I might have looked out for her myself." He rode away from the Tanners, promising to return later with the gift he had brought for Bud that he wanted to present himself, and Mrs. Tanner bustled back to her work again. "Well, I'm glad he's got home anyway," she remarked aloud to herself as she hung her dishcloth tidily over the upturned dishpan and took up her broom. "I ain't felt no ways easy 'bout her since she left, though I do suppose there ain't any sense to it, but I'm glad he's back." Meantime, Gardley was riding toward Rogers's ranch, meditating whether he should venture to follow the expedition and enjoy at least the return trip with Margaret, or whether he ought to remain patiently until she came back and go to work at once. There was nothing really important demanding his attention immediately, for Rogers had arranged to keep the present overseer of affairs until he was ready to undertake the work. He was on his way now to report on a small business matter which he had been attending to in New York for Rogers. When that was over he would be free to do as he pleased for a few more days if he liked, and the temptation was great to go at once to Margaret. As he stood waiting beside his horse in front of the house while the servant went to call Rogers, he looked about with delight on the beauty of the day. How glad he was to be back in Arizona again! Was it the charm of the place, or because Margaret was there? He wondered that he felt so happy. By all means he must follow her. Why should he not? He looked at the clambering rose vine that covered one end of the house, and noticed how it crept close to the window casement and caressed the white curtain as it blew. Margaret must have such a vine at her window in the house he would build for her. It might be but a modest house that he could give her now, but it should have a rose vine just like that, and he would train it round her window where she could smell the fragrance from it every morning when she awoke, and where it would breathe upon her as she slept. Margaret! How impatient he was to see her again, to look upon her dear face and know that she was his, that her father and mother had been satisfied about him and sent their blessing, and he might tell her so. It was wonderful. His heart thrilled with the thought of it. Of course, he would go to her at once. He would start as soon as Rogers was through with him. He would go to Ganado. No, Keams. Which was it? He drew the letter out of his pocket and read it again, then replaced it. The fluttering curtain up at the window blew out and in, and when it blew out again it brought with it a flurry of papers like white leaves. The curtain had knocked over a paperweight or vase or something that held them and set the papers free. The breeze caught them and flung them about erratically, tossing one almost at his feet. He stooped to pick it up, thinking it might be of value to someone, and caught the name Margaret and Dear Margaret written several times on the sheet, with Walpi, 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 filling the lower half of the page, as if someone had been practicing it. And because these two words were just now keenly in his mind, he reached for the second paper just a foot or two away and found more sentences and words. A third paper contained an exact reproduction of the letter which Mrs. Tanner had given him, purporting to come from Mrs. Brownleigh to Margaret. What could it possibly mean? In great astonishment he pulled out the other letter and compared them. They were almost identical, save for a word here and there crossed out and rewritten. He stood looking mutely at the papers and then up at the window, as though an explanation might somehow be wafted down to him, not knowing what to think, his mind filled with vague alarm. Just at that moment the servant appeared. "Mr. Rogers says, would you mind coming down to the corral? Miss Rosa has a headache, and we're keeping the house still for her to sleep. That's her window up there." And he indicated the rose-bowered window with the fluttering curtain. Dazed and half suspicious of something, Gardley folded the two letters together and crushed them into his pocket, wondering what he ought to do about it. The thought of it troubled him so that he only half gave attention to the business in hand, but he gave his report and handed over certain documents. He was thinking that perhaps he ought to see Miss Rosa and find out what she knew of Margaret's going and ask how she came in possession of this other letter. "Now," said Rogers, as the matter was concluded, "I owe you some money. If you'll just step up to the house with me, I'll give it to you. I'd like to settle matters up at once." "Oh, let it go till I come again," said Gardley, impatient to be off. He wanted to get by himself and think out a solution of the two letters. He was more than uneasy about Margaret without being able to give any suitable explanation of why he should be. His main desire now was to ride to Ganado and find out if the missionaries had left home, which way they had gone, and whether they had met Margaret as planned. "No, step right up to the house with me," insisted Rogers. "It won't take long, and I have the money in my safe." Gardley saw that the quickest way was to please Rogers, and he did not wish to arouse any questions, because he supposed, of course, his alarm was mere foolishness. So they went together into Rogers's private office, where his desk and safe were the principal furniture, and where no servants ventured to come without orders. Rogers shoved a chair for Gardley and went over to his safe, turning the little nickel knob this way and that with the skill of one long accustomed, and in a moment the thick door swung open and Rogers drew out a japanned cash box and unlocked it. But when he threw the cover back, he uttered an exclamation of angry surprise. The box was empty. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 32. Mr. Rogers strode to the door, forgetful of his sleeping daughter overhead, and thundered out his call for James. The servant appeared at once, but he knew nothing about the safe and had not been in the office that morning. Other servants were summoned and put through a rigid examination.
Then Rogers turned to the woman who had answered the door for Gardley and sent her up to call Rosa. But the woman returned presently with word that Miss Rosa was not in her room, and there was no sign that her bed had been slept in during the night. The woman's face was sullen. She did not like Rosa, but was afraid of her. This to her was only another of Miss Rosa's pranks, and very likely her doting father would manage to blame the servants with the affair. Mr. Rogers's face grew stern. His eyes flashed angrily as he turned and strode up the stairs to his daughter's room. But when he came down again, he was holding a note in his trembling hand, and his face was ashen white. "Read that, Gardley," he said, thrusting the note into Gardley's hands and motioning at the same time for the servants to go away. Gardley took the note, yet even as he read he noticed that the paper was the same as those he carried in his pocket. There was a peculiar watermark that made it noticeable. The note was a flippant little affair from Rosa telling her father she had gone away to be married and that she would let him know where she was as soon as they were located. She added that he had forced her to this step by being so severe with her and not allowing her lover to come to see her. If he had been reasonable, she would have stayed at home and let him give her a grand wedding. But as it was, she had only this way of seeking her happiness. She added that she knew he would forgive her, and she hoped he would come to see that her way had been best, and Forsythe was all that he could desire as a son-in-law. Gardley uttered an exclamation of dismay as he read, and looking up, found the miserable eyes of the stricken father upon him. For the moment his own alarm concerning Margaret and his perplexity about the letters were forgotten in the grief of the man who had been his friend. "When did she go?" asked Gardley, quickly looking up. "She took supper with me and then went to her room, complaining of a headache," said the father, his voice showing his utter hopelessness. "She may have gone early in the evening, perhaps, for we all turned in about 9 o'clock to keep the house quiet on her account." "Have you any idea which way they went, east or west?" Gardley was the keen adviser in a crisis now, his every sense on the alert. The old man shook his head. "It is too late now," he said, still in that colorless voice. "They will have reached the railroad somewhere. They will have been married by this time. See, it is after 10 o'clock." "Yes, if he marries her," said Gardley fiercely. He had no faith in Forsythe. You don't think he would dare?" The old man straightened up and fairly blazed in his righteous wrath. "I think he would dare anything if he thought he would not be caught. He is a coward, of course." "What can we do?" "Telegraph to detectives at all points where they would be likely to arrive and have them shadowed. Come, we will ride to the station at once. But first, could I go up in her room and look around? There might be some clue." "Certainly," said Rogers, pointing hopelessly up the stairs. "The first door to the left. But you'll find nothing. I looked everywhere. She wouldn't have left a clue. While you're up there I'll interview the servants. Then we'll go." As he went upstairs, Gardley was wondering whether he ought to tell Rogers of the circumstance of the 2 letters. What possible connection could there be between Margaret Earle's trip to Walpi with the Brownleighs and Rosa Rogers's elopement? When you come to think of it, what possible explanation was there for a copy of Mrs. Brownleigh's letter to blow out of Rosa Rogers's bedroom window? How could it have got there? Rosa's room was in beautiful order, the roses nodding in at the window, the curtain blowing back and forth in the breeze and rippling open the leaves of a tiny Testament lying on her desk, as if it had been recently read. There was nothing to show that the owner of the room had taken a hasty flight. On the desk lay several sheets of note paper with a peculiar watermark. These caught his attention, and he took them up and compared them with the papers in his pocket. It was a strange thing that letter, which had sent Margaret off into the wilderness with an unknown Indian, should be written on the same kind of paper as this. And yet, perhaps it was not so strange after all. It probably was the only note paper to be had in that region, and must all have been purchased at the same place. The rippling leaves of the Testament fluttered open at the flyleaf and revealed Rosa's name and a date with Mrs. Brownleigh's name written below. And Gardley took it up, startled again to find Hazel Brownleigh mixed up with the Rogers. He had not known that they had anything to do with each other, and yet, of course, they would, being the missionaries of the region. The almost empty wastebasket next caught his eye, and here again were several sheets of paper written over with words and phrases, words which at once he recognized as part of the letter Mrs. Tanner had given him. He emptied the wastebasket out on the desk, thinking perhaps there might be something there that would give a clue to where the elopers had gone. But there was not much else in it except a little yellowed note with the signature Hazel Brownleigh at the bottom. He glanced through the brief note, gathered its purport, and then spread it out deliberately on the desk and compared the writing with the others, a wild fear clutching at his heart. Yet he could not in any way explain why he was so uneasy. What possible reason could Rosa Rogers have for forging a letter to Margaret from Hazel Brownleigh? Suddenly Rogers stood behind him, looking over his shoulder. "What is it, Gardley? What have you found? Any clue?" "No clue," said Gardley uneasily, "but something strange I cannot understand. I don't suppose it can possibly have anything to do with your daughter, and yet it seems almost uncanny. This morning I stopped at the Tanners to let Miss Earle know I had returned, and was told she had gone yesterday with a couple of Indians as guide to meet the Brownleighs at Keams or somewhere near there. and take a trip with them to Walpi to see the Hopi Indians. Mrs. Tanner gave me this letter from Mrs. Brownlee, which Miss Earle had left behind. But when I reached here and was waiting for you, some papers blew out of your daughter's window. When I picked them up, I was startled to find that one of them was an exact copy of the letter I had in my pocket. See, here they are. I don't suppose there is anything to it, but in spite of me, I am a trifle uneasy about Miss Earle. I just can't understand how that copy of the letter came to be here." Rogers was leaning over, looking at the papers. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the note that came with the Testament. He read each paper carefully, took in the little Testament with its fluttering flyleaf and inscription, studied the pages of words and alphabet, then suddenly turned away and groaned, hiding his face in his hands. "What is it?" asked Gardley, awed with this awful sorrow in the strong man's attitude. "My poor baby!" groaned the father. "My poor little baby girl! I've always been afraid of that fatal gift of hers. Gardley, she could copy any handwriting in the world perfectly. She could write my name so it could not be told from my own signature. She's evidently written that letter. Why, I don't know, unless she wanted to get Miss Earle out of the way so it would be easier for her to carry out her plans." "It can't be," said Gardley, shaking his head. "I can't see what her object would be. Besides, where would she find the Indians? Mrs. Tanner saw the Indians. They came to the school after her with the letter and waited for her. Mrs. Tanner saw them ride off together." "There were a couple of strange Indians here yesterday begging something to eat," said Rogers, settling down on a chair and resting his head against the desk as if he had suddenly lost the strength to stand. "This won't do," said Gardley. "We've got to get down to the telegraph office, you and I. Now try to brace up. Are the horses ready? Then we'll go right away." "You better question the servants about those Indians first," said Rogers, and Gardley, as he hurried down the stairs, heard groan after groan from Rosa's room, where her father lingered in agony. Gardley got all the information he could about the Indians, and then the two men started away on a gallop to the station. As they passed the Tanner house, Gardley drew rein to call to Bud, who hurried out joyfully to greet his friend, his face lighting with pleasure. "Bill, get on your horse in double quick time and beat it out to camp for me, will you?" said Gardley as he reached down and gripped Bud's raw young paw. "Tell Jasper Kemp to come back with you and meet me at the station as quick as he can. Tell him to have the men where he can signal them. We may have to hustle out on a long hunt. And, Bill, keep your head steady and get back yourself right away. Perhaps I'll want you to help me. I'm a little anxious about Miss Earle, but you needn't tell anybody that but old Jasper. Tell him to hurry for all he's worth." Bud, with his eyes large with loyalty and trouble, nodded understandingly, returned the grip of the young man's hand with a clumsy squeeze, and sprang away to get his horse and do Gardley's bidding. Gardley knew he would ride as for his life, now that he knew Margaret's safety was at stake. Then Gardley rode on to the station and was indefatigable for 2 hours hunting out addresses, writing telegrams, and calling up long-distance telephones. When all had been done that was possible, Rogers turned a haggard face to the young man. "I've been thinking, Gardley, that rash little girl of mine may have got Miss Earle into some kind of dangerous position. You ought to look after her. What can we do?" "I'm going to, sir," said Gardley, "just as soon as I've done everything I can for you. I've already sent for Jasper Kemp, and we'll make a plan between us and find out if Miss Earle is all right. Can you spare Jasper, or will you need him?" "By all means. Take all the men you need. I shan't rest easy till I know Miss Earle is safe." He sank down on a truck that stood on the station platform, his shoulders slumping, his whole attitude as of one who was fatally stricken. It came over Gardley how suddenly old he looked, and haggard and gray. What a thing for the selfish child to have done to her father! Poor, silly child, whose fate with Forsythe would in all probability be anything but enviable. But there was no time for sorrowful reflections. Jasper Kemp, stern, alert, anxious, came riding furiously down the street, Bud keeping even pace with him. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 33. While Gardley briefly told his tale to Jasper Kemp, and the Scotchman was hastily scanning the papers with his keen, bright eyes, Bud stood frowning and listening intently. "Gee!" he bust forth. "That girl's a mess. Course she did it. You ought to seen what all she didn't do the last 6 weeks of school. Miss Margaret got so shivered every time that girl came near her or looked at her. She sure had her goat. Some nights after school, when she thought she's all alone, she just cried. She did. Why, Rosa had every one of those guys in the back seat acting like the devil, and nobody knew what was the matter. She wrote things on the blackboard, writing the questions, so's it looked like Miss Margaret's writing. Fierce things sometimes, and Miss Margaret didn't know who did it, and she was as jealous as a cat of Miss Margaret. You all know what a case she had on that guy from over by the fort, and she didn't like to have him even look at Miss Margaret. Well, she didn't forget how he went away that night of the play. I caught her looking at her like she would like to murder her. Good night, some look! That guy had a case on Miss Margaret all right, too, only she was on to him and wouldn't look at him nor let him spoon nor nothing. But Rosa saw it all, and she just hated Miss Margaret. Then once Miss Margaret stopped her from going out to meet that guy, too, oh, she hated her all right, and you can bet she wrote the letter. Sure she did. She wanted to get her away when that guy came back. He was back yesterday. I saw him over by the run on that trail that crosses the trail to the old cabin. He didn't see me. I got my eye on him first, and I chucked behind some sagebrush. But he was here all right, and he didn't mean any good. I followed him a while till he stopped and fixed up a place to camp. I guess he must have stayed out last night." A heavy hand was suddenly laid from behind on Bud's shoulder, and Rogers stood over him, his dark eyes on fire, his lips trembling. "Boy, can you show me where that was?" he asked, and there was an intensity in his voice that showed Bud that something serious was the matter. Boy-like, he dropped his eyes indifferently before this great emotion. "Sure." "Best take Long Bill with you, Mr. Rogers," advised Jasper Kemp, keenly alive to the whole situation. "I reckon we'll all have to work together. My men ain't far off," and he lifted his whistle to his lips and blew the signal blasts. "The kid here'll want to ride to Keams to see if the lady is all safe and has met her friends. I reckon maybe I better go straight to Ganado and find out if them mission folks really got started and put 'em wise to what's been going on. They'll maybe know who them Injuns was. I have my suspicions they weren't any friendlies. I didn't like that Injun the minute I set eyes on him hanging round the schoolhouse, but I wouldn't have stirred a step toward camp if I'd have suspected he was come for the lady. S'pose you take Bud and Long Bill and go find that camping place and see if you find any trail showing which way they took. If you do, you fire 3 shots and the men'll be with you. If you want the kid, fire 4 shots. He can't be so fur away by that time that he can't hear. He's got to be provisioned 'fore he starts. Lead him out, Bud. We ain't got no time to lose." Bud gave one despairing look at Gardley and turned to obey. "That's all right, Bud," said Gardley with an understanding glance. "You tell Mr. Rogers all you know and show him the place, and then when Long Bill comes you can take the cross cut to the Long Trail and go with me. I'll just stop at the house as I go by and tell your mother I need you." Bud gave one radiant, grateful look and sprang up on his horse, and Rogers had hard work to keep up with him at first, till Bud got interested in giving him a detailed account of Forsythe's looks and acts. In less than an hour the relief expedition had started. Before night had fallen, Jasper Kemp, riding hard, arrived at the mission, told his story, procured a fresh horse, and after a couple of hours, rest started with Brownlee and his wife for Keams Cañon. Gardley and Bud, riding for all they were worth, said little by the way. Now and then the boy stole glances at the man's face, and the dead weight of sorrow settled like lead, the heavier upon his heart. Too well he knew the dangers of the desert. He could almost read Gardley's fears in the white, drawn look upon his lips, the ashen circles under his eyes, the tense, strained pose of his whole figure. Gardley's mind was urging ahead of his steed, and his body could not relax. He was anxious to go a little faster, yet his judgment knew it would not do, for his horse would play out before he could get another. They ate their cornbread in the saddle and only turned aside from the trail once to drink at a water hole and fill their cans. They rode late into the night, with only the stars and their wits to guide them. When they stopped to rest, they did not wait to make a fire, but hobbled the horses where they might feed, and rolling quickly in their blankets, lay down upon the ground. Bud, with the fatigue of healthy youth, would have slept till morning in spite of his fears, but Gardley woke him in a couple of hours, made him drink some water and eat a bite of food, and they went on their way again. When morning broke they were almost to the entrance of Keams Cañon, and both looked haggard and worn. Bud seemed to have aged in the night, and Gardley looked at him almost tenderly. "Are you all in, kid?" he asked. "Naw," answered Bud promptly, with an assumed cheerfulness, feeling like a 4-year-old. "Get on to that sky? Guess we're going to have some day. Pretty as a red wagon." Gardley smiled sadly. What would that day bring forth for the two who went in search of her they loved? His great anxiety was to get to Keams Cañon and inquire. They would surely know at the trading post whether the missionary and his party had gone that way. The road was still almost impassable from the flood. The two dauntless riders picked their way slowly down the trail to the post. But the trader could tell them nothing comforting. The missionary had not been that way in 2 months, and there had been no party and no lady there that week. A single strange Indian had come down the trail above the day before, stayed a while, picked a quarrel with some men who were there, and then ridden back up the steep trail again. He might have had a party with him up on the mesa waiting. He had said something about his squaw. The trader admitted that he might have been drunk, but he frowned as he spoke of him. He called him a bad Indian. Something unpleasant had evidently happened. The trader gave them a good hot dinner, of which they stood sorely in need, and because they realized that they must keep up their strength, they took the time to eat it. Then, procuring fresh horses, they climbed the steep trail in the direction the trader said the Indian had taken. It was a slender clue, but it was all they had, and they must follow it. And now the travelers were very silent, as if they felt they were drawing near to some knowledge that would settle the question for them one way or the other. As they reached the top at last, where they could see out across the plain, each drew a long breath like a gasp and looked about, half fearing what he might see. Yes, there was the sign of a recent campfire and a few tin cans and bits of refuse. Nothing more. Gardley got down and searched carefully. Bud even crept about upon his hands and knees, but a single tiny blue bead, like a grain of sand, was all that rewarded his efforts. Some Indian had doubtless camped here. That was all the evidence.
Standing thus,
in hopeless uncertainty what to do next, they suddenly heard voices. Something familiar once or twice made Gardley lift his whistle and blow a blast. Instantly a silvery answer came, ringing from the mesa a mile or so away, and woke the echoes in the cañon. Jasper Kemp and his party had taken the longer way around instead of going down the cañon, and were just arriving at the spot where Margaret and the squaw had waited 2 days before for their drunken guide. But Jasper Kemp's whistle rang out again, and he shot 3 times into the air, their signal to wait for some important news. Breathlessly and in silence the two waited till the coming of the rest of the party, and cast themselves down on the ground, feeling the sudden need of support. Now that there was a possibility of some news, they felt hardly able to bear it, and the waiting for it was intolerable. To such a point of anxious tension were they strained. But when the party from Ganado came in sight, their faces wore no brightness of good news. Their greetings were quiet, sad, anxious, and Jasper Kemp held out to Gardley an envelope. It was the one from Margaret's mother's letter that she had dropped upon the trail. "We found it on the way from Ganado, just as we entered Steamboat Cañon," explained Jasper. "And didn't you search for a trail off in any other direction?" asked Gardley, almost sharply. "They have not been here. At least only one Indian has been down to the trader's." "There was no other trail. We looked," said Jasper sadly. "There was a campfire twice, and signs of a camp. We felt sure they had come this way." Gardley shook his head, and a look of abject despair came over his face. "There is no sign here," he said. "They must have gone some other way. Perhaps the Indian has carried her off. Are the other men following?" "No. Rogers sent them in the other direction after his girl. They found the camp all right. Bud tell you? We made sure we had found our trail and would not need them." Gardley dropped his head and almost groaned. Meanwhile, the missionary had been riding around in radiating circles from the dead camp fire, searching every step of the way, and Bud, taking his cue from him, looked off toward the mesa a minute, then struck out in a straight line for it and rode off like mad. Suddenly there was heard a shout, loud and long, and Bud came riding back, waving something small and white above his head. They gathered in a little knot, waiting for the boy, not speaking, and when he halted in their midst he fluttered down the handkerchief to Gardley. "It's hers, all right. Got her name all written out on the edge," he declared radiantly. The sky grew brighter to them all now. Eagerly Gardley sprang into his saddle, no longer weary, but alert and eager for the trail. "You folks better go down to the trader's and get some dinner. You'll need it. Bud and I'll go on. Mrs. Brownlee looks all in." "No," declared Hazel decidedly. "We'll just snatch a bite here and follow you at once. I couldn't enjoy a dinner till I know she is safe." And so, though both Jasper Kemp and her husband urged her otherwise, she would take a hasty meal by the way and hurry on. But Bud and Gardley waited not for others. They plunged wildly ahead. It seemed a long way to the eager hunters from the place where Bud had found the handkerchief to the little note twisted around the red chessman. It was perhaps nearly a mile, and both of the riders had searched in all directions for some time before Gardley spied it.
Eagerly he seized upon the note, recognizing the little red mannikin with which he had whiled away an hour with Margaret during one of her visits at the camp.
The note was written large and clear upon a sheet of writing paper. "I am Margaret Earle, school teacher at Ashland. I am supposed to be traveling to Walpi by way of Keams to meet Mr. and Mrs. Brownlee of Ganado. I am with an Indian, his squaw and papoose. The Indian said he was sent to guide me, but he is drunk now, and I am frightened. He has acted strangely all the way. I do not know where I am. Please come and help me." Bud, sitting anxious like a statue upon his horse, read Gardley's face as Gardley read the note. Then Gardley read it aloud to Bud, and before the last word was fairly out of his mouth, both man and boy started as if they had heard Margaret's beloved voice calling them. It was not long before Bud found another scrap of paper about a half-mile farther on, and then another and another, scattered at great distances along the way. The only way they had of being sure she had dropped them was that they seemed to be the same kind of paper as that upon which the note was written. How that note with its brave, frightened appeal wrung the heart of Gardley as he thought of Margaret, unprotected, in terror, and perhaps in peril, riding on she knew not where. What trials and fears had she not already passed through? What might she not be experiencing even now while he searched for her? It was perhaps 2 hours before he found the little white stocking dropped where the trail divided, showing which way she had taken. Gardley folded it reverently and put it in his pocket. An hour later Bud pounced upon the bedroom slipper and carried it gleefully to Gardley. And so by slow degrees, finding here and there a chessman or more paper, they came at last to the camp, where the Indians had abandoned their trust and fled, leaving Margaret alone in the wilderness. It was then that Gardley searched in vain for any further clue, and riding wide in every direction, stopped and called her name again and again, while the sun grew lower and lower and shadows crept in lurking places, waiting for the swift coming night. It was then that Bud, flying frantically from one spot to another,
got down upon his knees
behind a sage bush when Gardley was not looking and mumbled a rough, hasty prayer for help. He felt like the old woman who, on being told that nothing but God could save the ship, exclaimed, "And has it come to that?" Bud had felt all his life that there was a remote time in every life when one might need to believe in prayer. The time had come for Bud. Margaret, on her knees in the sand of the desert praying for help, remembered the promise. "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear," and knew not that her deliverers were on the way. The sun had been hot as it beat down upon the whiteness of the sand, and the girl had crept under a sage bush for shelter from it. The pain in her ankle was sickening. She had removed her shoe and bound the ankle about with a handkerchief soaked with half of her bottle of witch hazel, and so, lying quiet, had fallen asleep, too exhausted with pain and anxiety to stay awake any longer. When she awoke again, the softness of evening was hovering over everything, and she started up and listened. Surely she had heard a voice calling her. She sat up sharply and listened. Ah, there it was again, a faint echo in the distance. Was it a voice, or was it only her dreams mingling with her fancies? Travelers in deserts, she had read, took all sorts of fancies, saw mirages, heard sounds that were not, but she had not been out long enough to have caught such a desert fever. Perhaps she was going to be sick. Still that faint echo made her heart beat wildly. She dragged herself to her knees, then to her feet, standing painfully with the weight on her well foot. The suffering horse turned his anguished eyes and whinnied. Her heart ached for him, yet there was no way she could assuage his pain or put him out of his misery. But she must make sure if she had heard a voice. Could she possibly scale that rock down which she and her horse had fallen? For then she might look out farther and see if there were anyone in sight. Painfully she crawled and crept up and up, inch by inch, until at last she gained the little height and could look afar. There was no living thing in sight. The air was very clear. The eagle had found his evening rest somewhere in a quiet crag. The long corn waved on the distant plain, and all was deathly still once more. There was a hint of coming sunset in the sky. Her heart sank, and she was about to give up hope entirely when, rich and clear, there it came again, a voice in the wilderness calling her name. Margaret! Margaret! The tears rushed to her eyes and crowded in her throat. She could not answer. She was so overwhelmed, and though she tried twice to call out, she could make no sound. But the call kept coming again and again. Margaret! Margaret! And it was Gardley's voice. Impossible! For Gardley was far away and could not know her need. Yet it was his voice. Had she died, or was she in delirium, that she seemed to hear him calling her name? But the call came clearer now. Margaret! Margaret! I am coming! And like a flash her mind went back to the first night in Arizona when she heard him singing, "From the desert I come to thee." Now she struggled to her feet again and shouted inarticulately and gladly through her tears. She could see him. It was Gardley. He was riding fast toward her, and he shot 3 times into the air above him as he rode, and 3 shrill blasts of his whistle rang out on the still evening air. She tore the scarf from her neck that she had tied about it to keep the sun from blistering her, and waved it wildly in the air now, shouting in happy, choking sobs. And so he came to her across the desert. He sprang down before the horse had fairly reached her side, and rushing to her, took her in his arms. "Margaret, my darling, I have found you at last." She swayed and would have fallen but for his arms, and then he saw her white face and knew she must be suffering. "You are hurt," he cried. "Oh, what have they done to you?" And he laid her gently down upon the sand and dropped on his knees beside her. "Oh, no!" she gasped joyously with white lips. "I'm all right now. Only my ankle hurts a little. We had a fall, the horse and I. Oh, go to him at once and put him out of his pain. I'm sure his legs are broken." For answer, Gardley put the whistle to his lips and blew a blast. He would not leave her for an instant. He was not sure yet that she was not more hurt than she had said. He set about discovering at once, for he had brought with him supplies for all emergencies. It was Bud who came riding madly across the mesa in answer to the call, reaching Gardley before anyone else. Bud with his eyes shining, his cheeks blazing with excitement, his hair wildly flying in the breeze, his young, boyish face suddenly grown old with lines of anxiety. But you wouldn't have known from his greeting that it was anything more than a pleasure excursion he had been on the past 2 days. "Good work, kid!
What you want me to do?" It was Bud who arranged the camp and went back to tell the other detachments that Margaret was found. Bud who led the pack horse up, unpacked the provisions, and gathered wood to start a fire. Bud was everywhere, with a smudged face, a weary, gray look around his eyes, and his hair sticking 7 ways for Sunday. Yet once, when his labors led him near to where Margaret lay weak and happy on a couch of blankets, he gave her an unwonted pat on her shoulder and said in low tone, "Hello, gang. See you kept your nerve with you." And then he gave her a grin all across his dirty, tired face and moved away as if he were half ashamed of his emotion. But it was Bud again who came and talked with her to divert her so that she wouldn't notice when they shot her horse. He talked loudly about a coyote they shot the night before and a cottontail they saw at Keams, and when he saw that she understood what the shot meant and there were tears in her eyes, he gave her hand a rough bear squeeze and said gruffly, "You should worry. He's better off now." And when Gardley came back he took himself thoughtfully to a distance and busied himself opening tins of meat and soup. In another hour the Brownleys arrived, having heard the signals, and they had a supper around the campfire, everybody so rejoiced that there were still quivers in their voices, and when anyone laughed it sounded like the echo of a sob, so great had been the strain of their anxiety. Gardley, sitting beside Margaret in the starlight afterward, her hand in his, listened to the story of her journey, the strong, tender pressure of his fingers telling her how deeply it affected him to know the peril through which she had passed. Later, when the others were telling gay stories about the fire and Bud lying full length in their midst had fallen fast asleep, these two, a little apart from the rest, were murmuring their innermost thoughts in low tones to each other and rejoicing that they were together once more. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of A Voice in the Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 34. They talked it over the next morning at breakfast as they sat around the fire. Jasper Kemp thought he ought to get right back to attend to things. Mr. Rogers was all broken up and might even need him to search for Rosa if they had not found out her whereabouts yet. He and Fiddling Boss, who had come along, would start back at once. They had had a good night's rest and had found their dear lady. What more did they need? Besides, there were not provisions for an indefinite stay for such a large party, and there were none too many sources of supply in this region. The missionary thought that, now he was here, he ought to go on to Walpi. It was not more than 2 hours' ride there, and Hazel could stay with the camp while Margaret's ankle had a chance to rest and let the swelling subside under treatment. Margaret, however, rebelled. She did not wish to be an invalid, and was very sure she could ride without injury to her ankle. She wanted to see Walpi and the queer Hopi Indians now she was so near. So a compromise was agreed upon. They would all wait in camp a couple of days, and then, if Margaret felt well enough, they would go on, visit the Hopis, and so go home together. Bud pleaded to be allowed to stay with them, and Jasper Kemp promised to make it all right with his parents. So for 2 whole long, lovely days the little party of 5 camped on the mesa and enjoyed sweet converse. It is safe to say that never in all Bud's life will he forget or get away from the influences of that day in such company. Gardley and the missionary proved to be the best of physicians, and Margaret's ankle improved hourly under their united treatment of compresses, lotions, and rest. About noon on Saturday they broke camp, mounted their horses, and rode away across the stretch of white sand, through tall cornfields growing right up out of the sand, closer and closer to the great mesa, with the castle-like pueblos 500 feet above them on the top. It seemed to Margaret like suddenly being dropped into Egypt or the Holy Land, or some of the Babylonian excavations, so curious and primitive and altogether different from anything else she had ever seen did it all appear.
She listened, fascinated, while Brownlee told about this strange Hopi land, the strangest spot in America. Spanish explorers found them away back years before the Pilgrims landed and called the country Tuscan. They built their homes up high for protection from their enemies. They lived on the corn, pumpkins, peaches, and melons which they raised in the valley, planting the seeds with their hands. It is supposed they got their seeds first from the Spaniards years ago. They make pottery, cloth, and baskets, and are a busy people. There are 7 villages built on 3 mesas in the northern desert. One of the largest, Orabi, has 1,000 inhabitants. Walpi numbers about 230 people, all living in this one great building of many rooms. They are divided into brotherhoods, or phratries, and each brotherhood has several large families. They are ruled by a speaker chief and a war chief elected by a council of clan elders. Margaret learned with wonder that all the water these people used had to be carried by the women in jars on their backs 500 feet up the steep trail. Presently, as they drew nearer, a curious man with his hair banged like a child's and garments much like those usually worn by scarecrows, a shapeless kind of shirt and trousers, appeared along the steep and showed them the way up. Margaret and the missionary's wife exclaimed in horror over the little children playing along the very edge of the cliffs above as carelessly as birds in trees. High up on the mesa at last, how strange and weird it seemed. Far below the yellow sand of the valley, 15 miles away, a second mesa, stretching dark. To the southwest, 100 miles distant, the dim outlines of the San Francisco peaks. Some little children on burros crossing the sand below looked as if they were part of a curious moving picture, not as if they were little living things, taking life as seriously as other children do. The great wide desert stretching far, the bare solid rocks beneath their feet, the curious houses behind them. It all seemed unreal to Margaret, like a great picture book spread out for her to see. She turned from gazing and found Gardley's eyes upon her adoringly, a tender understanding of her mood in his glance. She thrilled with pleasure to be here with him. A soft flush spread over her cheeks, and a light came into her eyes. They found the Indians preparing for one of their most famous ceremonies, the snake dance, which was to take place in a few days. For almost a week the snake priests had been busy hunting rattlesnakes, building altars, drawing figures in the sand, and singing weird songs. On the 9th day the snakes are washed in a pool and driven near a pile of sand. The priests, arrayed in paint, feathers, and charms, come out in line, and taking the live snakes in their mouths, parade up and down the rocks, while the people crowd the roofs and terraces of the pueblos to watch. There are helpers to whip the snakes and keep them from biting, and catchers to see that none get away. In a little while the priests take the snakes down on the desert and set them free, sending them north, south, east, and west, where it is supposed they will take the people's prayers for rain to the water serpent in the underworld, who is in some way connected with the god of the rain clouds. It was a strange experience that night in Walpi. The primitive accommodations, the picturesque, uncivilized people, the shy glances from dark, eager eyes, to watch 2 girls grinding corn between 2 stones, and a little farther off their mother rolling out her dough with an ear of corn, and cooking over an open fire, her pot slung from a crude crane over the blaze. It was all too unreal to be true. But the most interesting thing about it was to watch the Anishadi going about among them, his face alight with warm human love, his hearty laugh ringing out in a joke that the Hopis seemed to understand, making himself one with them. It came to Margaret suddenly to remember the pompous little figure of the Reverend Frederick West, and to fancy him going about among these people and trying to do them good. Before she knew what she was doing, she laughed aloud at the thought. Then, of course, she had to explain to Bud and Gardley, who looked at her inquiringly. "Aw, gee, him? He wasn't a minister. He was a mistake. Forget him, the poor simp," growled Bud sympathetically. Then his eyes softened as he watched Brownlee playing with three little Indian maids, having a fine romp. "Gee, he certainly is a peach, isn't he?" he murmured, his whole face kindling appreciatively. "Gee, I bet that kid never forgets that." The Sunday was a wonderful day when the missionary gathered the people together and spoke to them in simple words of God, their God who made the sky, the stars, the mountains, and the sun, whom they call by different names, but whom he called God. He spoke of the book of heaven that told about God and his great love for men, so great that he sent his Son to save them from their sin. It was not a long sermon, but a very beautiful one, and listening to the simple, wonderful words of life that fell from the missionary's earnest lips and were translated by his faithful Indian interpreter, who always went with him on his expeditions, watching the faces of the dark, strange people as they took in the marvelous meaning, the little company of visitors was strangely moved. Even Bud, awed beyond his wont, said shyly to Margaret, "Gee, it's something fierce not to be born a Christian and know all that, ain't it?" Margaret and Gardley walked a little way down the narrow path that led out over the neck of rock less than a rod wide that connects the great promontory with the mesa. The sun was setting in majesty over the desert, and the scene was one of breathless beauty. One might fancy it might look so to stand on the hills of God and look out over creation when all things have been made new. They stood for a while in silence. Then Margaret looked down at the narrow path worn more than a foot deep in the solid rock by the 10 generations of feet that had been passing over it. "Just think," she said, "of all the feet, little and big, that have walked here in all the years, and of all the souls that have stood and looked out over this wonderful sight. It must be that somehow, in spite of their darkness, they have reached out to the God who made this and have found a way to his heart. They couldn't look at this and not feel him, could they? It seems to me that perhaps some of those poor creatures who have stood here, reached up blindly after the Creator of their souls, have, perhaps, been as pleasing to him as those who have known about him from childhood." Gardley was used to her talking this way. He had not been in her Sunday meetings for nothing. He understood and sympathized, and now his hand reached softly for hers and held it tenderly. After a moment of silence he said, "I surely think if God could reach and find me in the desert of my life, he must have found them. I sometimes think I was a greater heathen than all these, because I knew and would not see." Margaret nestled her hand in his and looked up joyfully into his face. "I'm so glad you know him now," she murmured happily. They stood for some time looking out over the changing scene, till the crimson faded into rose, the silver into gray, till the stars bloomed out one by one, and down in the valley across the desert a light twinkled faintly here and there from the camps of the Hopi shepherds. They started home at daybreak the next morning, the whole company of Indians standing on the rocks to send them royally on their way, pressing simple, homely gifts upon them and begging them to return soon again and tell the blessed story. A wonderful ride they had back to Ganado, where Gardley left Margaret for a short visit, promising to return for her in a few days when she was rested, and hastened back to Ashland to his work, for his soul was happy now and at ease, and he felt he must get to work at once. Rogers would need him. Poor Rogers! Had he found his daughter yet? Poor, silly child prodigal! But when Gardley reached Ashland, he found among his mail awaiting him a telegram. His uncle was dead, and the fortune which he had been brought up to believe was his, and which he had idly tossed away in a moment of recklessness, had been restored to him by the uncle's last will, made since Gardley's recent visit home. The fortune was his again. Gardley sat in his office on the Rogers ranch and stared hard at the adobe wall opposite his desk. That fortune would be great. He could do such wonderful things for Margaret now. They could work out their dreams together for the people they loved. He could see the shadows of those dreams. A beautiful home for Margaret out on the trail she loved, where wildness and beauty and the mountains she called hers were not far away. Horses in plenty, and a luxurious car when they wanted to take a trip. Journeys east as often as they wished. Some of the ideal appliances for the school that Margaret loved. A church for the missionary, and convenient halls where he could speak at his outlying districts. A trip to the city for Mom Wallis, where she might see a real picture gallery, her one expressed desire this side of heaven, now that she had taken to reading Browning and had some of it explained to her. Oh, and a lot of wonderful things. These all hung in the dream picture before Gardley's eyes as he sat at his desk with that bit of yellow paper in his hand. He thought of what that money had represented to him in the past. Reckless days and nights of folly as a boy and young man at college, ruthless waste of time, money, youth, shriveling of soul, till Margaret came and found and rescued him. How wonderful that he had been rescued, that he had come to his senses at last, and was here in a man's position, doing a man's work in the world. Now, with all that money, there was no need for him to work and earn more. He could live idly all his days and just have a good time, make others happy too. But still he would not have this exhilarating feeling that he was supplying his own and Margaret's necessities by the labor of hand and brain. The little telegram in his hand seemed somehow to be trying to snatch from him all this material prosperity that was the symbol of that spiritual regeneration which had become so dear to him. He put his head down on his clasped hands upon the desk then and prayed. Perhaps it was the first great prayer of his life. Oh, God, let me be strong enough to stand this that has come upon me. Help me to be a man in spite of money. Don't let me lose my manhood and my right to work. Help me to use the money in the right way and not to dwarf myself nor spoil our lives with it. It was a great prayer for a man such as Gardley had been, and the answer came swiftly in his conviction. He lifted up his head with purpose in his expression, and folding the telegram, put it safely back into his pocket. He would not tell Margaret of it, not just yet. He would think it out, just the right way, and he did not believe he meant to give up his position with Rogers. He had accepted it for a year in good faith, and it was his business to fulfill the contract. Meantime, this money would perhaps make possible his marriage with Margaret sooner than he had hoped. 5 minutes later, Rogers telephoned to the office. I've decided to take that shipment of cattle and try that new stock, provided you will go out and look at them and see that everything is all okay. I couldn't go myself now. Don't feel like going anywhere, you know. You wouldn't need to go for a couple of weeks. I've just had a letter from the man, and he says he won't be ready sooner. Say, why don't you and Miss Earle get married and make this a wedding trip? She could go to the Pacific coast with you. It would be a nice trip. Then I could spare you for a month or 6 weeks when you got back if you wanted to take her east for a little visit. Why not? Gardley stumbled out his thanks and hung up the receiver, his face full of the light of a great joy. How were the blessings pouring down upon his head these days? Was it a sign that God was pleased with his action in making good what he could where he had failed? And Rogers, how kind he was! Poor Rogers, with his broken heart and his stricken home. For Rosa had come home again, a sadder, wiser child, and her father seemed crushed with the disgrace of it all. Gardley went to Margaret that very afternoon. He told her only that he had had some money left him by his uncle, which would make it possible for him to marry at once and keep her comfortably now. He was to be sent to California on a business trip. Would she be married and go with him? Margaret studied the telegram in wonder. She had never asked Gardley much about his circumstances. The telegram merely stated that his uncle's estate was left to him. To her simple mind an estate might be a few $100s, enough to furnish a plain little home, and her face lighted with joy over it. She asked no questions, and Gardley said no more about the money. He had forgotten that question comparatively in the greater possibility of joy. Would she be married in 10 days and go with him? Her eyes met his with an answering joy, and yet he could see that there was a trouble hiding somewhere. He presently saw what it was without needing to be told. Her father and mother! Of course they would be disappointed. They would want her to be married at home. But Rogers said we could go and visit them for several weeks on our return, he said, and Margaret's face lighted up. Oh, that would be beautiful, she said wistfully. And perhaps they won't mind so much, though I always expected Father would marry me if I was ever married. Still, if we can go home so soon and for so long, and Mr. Brownlee would be next best, of course. But, of course, your father must marry you, said Gardley determinedly. Perhaps we could persuade him to come, and your mother, too. Oh, no, they couldn't possibly, said Margaret quickly, a shade of sadness in her eyes. You know it costs a lot to come out here, and ministers are never rich. It was then that Gardley's eyes lighted with joy. His money could take this bugbear away, at least. However, he said nothing about the money. Suppose we write to your father and mother and put the matter before them. See what they say. We'll send the letters tonight. You write your mother, and I'll write your father. Margaret agreed and sat down at once to write her letter, while Gardley, on the other side of the room, wrote his, scratching away contentedly with his fountain pen and looking furtively now and then toward the bowed head over at the desk. Gardley did not read his letter to Margaret. She wondered a little at this, but did not ask, and the letters were mailed, with special delivery stamps on them. Gardley awaited their replies with great impatience. He filled in the days of waiting with business. There were letters to write connected with his fortune, and there were arrangements to be made for his trip. But the thing that occupied the most of his time and thought was the purchase and refitting of a roomy old ranch house in a charming location not more than 3 miles from Ashland, on the road to the camp. It had been vacant for a couple of years past, the owner having gone abroad permanently and the place having been offered for sale. Margaret had often admired it in her trips to and from the camp, and Gardley thought of it at once when it became possible for him to think of purchasing a home in the West. There was a great stone fireplace, and the beams of the ceilings and pillars of the porch and wide, hospitable rooms were of tree trunks with the bark on them. With a little work it could be made roughly but artistically habitable. Gardley had it cleaned up, not disturbing the tangle of vines and shrubbery that had had their way since the last owner had left them, and which had made a perfect screen from the road for the house. Behind this screen the men worked, most of them the men from the bunkhouse, whom Gardley took into his confidence. The floors were carefully scrubbed under the direction of Mom Wallis, and the windows made shining. Then the men spent a day bringing great loads of tree boughs and filling the place with green fragrance until the big living room looked like a woodland bower. Gardley made a raid upon some Indian friends of his and came back with several fine Navajo rugs and blankets, which he spread about the room luxuriously on the floor and over the rude benches which the men had constructed. They piled the fireplace with big logs, and Gardley took over some of his own personal possessions that he had brought back from the East with him to give the place a livable look. Then he stood back satisfied. The place was fit to bring his bride and her friends to. Not that it was as it should be. That would be for Margaret to do, but it would serve as a temporary stopping place if there came need. If no need came, why, the place was there, anyway, hers and his. A tender light grew in his eyes as he looked it over in the dying light of the afternoon. Then he went out and rode swiftly to the telegraph office and found these 2 telegrams according to the request in his own letter to Mr. Earle. Gardley's telegram read, "Congratulations. Will come as you desire. We await your advice. Have written Father." He saddled his horse and hurried to Margaret with hers, and together they read, "Dear child, so glad for you. Of course you will go. I am sending you some things. Don't take a thought for us. We shall look forward to your visit. Our love to you both. Mother." Margaret, folded in her lover's arms, cried out her sorrow and her joy and lifted up her face with happiness. Then Gardley, with great joy, thought of the surprise he had in store for her and laid his face against hers to hide the telltale smile in his eyes. For Gardley, in his letter to his future father-in-law, had written of his newly inherited fortune and had not only enclosed a check for a good sum to cover all extra expense of the journey, but had said that a private car would be at their disposal, not only for themselves, but for any of Margaret's friends and relatives whom they might choose to invite. As he had written this letter, he was filled with deep thanksgiving that it was in his power to do this thing for his dear girl bride. The morning after the telegrams arrived, Gardley spent several hours writing telegrams and receiving them from a big department store in the nearest great city, and before noon a big shipment of goods was on its way to Ashland. Beds, bureaus, wash stands, chairs, tables, dishes, kitchen utensils, and all kinds of bedding, even to sheets and pillowcases, he ordered with lavish hand. After all, he must furnish the house himself and let Margaret weed it out or give it away afterward if she did not like it. He was going to have a house party, and he must be ready. When all was done and he was just about to mount his horse again, he turned back and sent another message ordering a piano. "Why, it's great," he said to himself as he rode back to his office. "It's simply great to be able to do things just when I need them. I never knew what fun money was before. But then I never had Margaret to spend it for, and she's worth the whole of it at once." The next thing he ordered was a great easy carriage with plenty of room to convey Mother Earle and her friends from the train to the house. The days went by rapidly enough, and Margaret was so busy that she had little time to wonder and worry why her mother did not write her the long, loving, motherly good-bye letter to her little girlhood that she had expected to get. Not until 3 days before the wedding did it come over her that she had had but 3 brief, scrappy letters from her mother, and they not a whole page apiece. What could be the matter with Mother? She was almost on the point of panic when Gardley came and bundled her on to her horse for a ride. Strangely enough, he directed their way through Ashland and down to the station, and it was just about the time of the arrival of the evening train. Gardley excused himself for a moment, saying something about an errand, and went into the station. Margaret sat on her horse, watching the oncoming train, the great connecting link between East and West, and wondered if it would bring a letter from Mother. The train rushed to a halt, and behold, some passengers were getting off from a private car. Margaret watched them idly, thinking more about an unexpected letter than about the people. Then suddenly she awoke to the fact that Gardley was greeting them. Who could they be? There were 5 of them, and one of them looked like Jane. Dear Jane! She had forgotten to write her about this hurried wedding. How different it all was going to be from what she and Jane had planned for each other in their dear old school day dreams. And that young man that Gardley was shaking hands with now looked like Cousin Dick. She hadn't seen him for 3 years, but he must look like that now. And the younger girl beside him might be Cousin Emily. But, oh, who were the others? Father and Mother! Margaret sprang from her horse with a bound and rushed into her mother's arms. The interested passengers craned their necks and looked their fill with smiles of appreciation as the train took up its way again, having dropped the private car on the side track. Dick and Emily rode the ponies to the house, while Margaret nestled in the back seat of the carriage between her father and mother, and Jane got acquainted with Gardley in the front seat of the carriage. Margaret never even noticed where they were going until the carriage turned in and stopped before the door of the new house, and Mrs. Tanner, furtively casting behind her the checked apron she had worn, came out to shake hands with the company and tell them supper was all ready, before she went back to her deserted boarding house. Even Bud was going to stay at the new house that night in some cooked-up capacity or other, and all the men from the bunkhouse were hiding out among the trees to see Margaret's father and mother and shake hands if the opportunity offered. The wonder and delight of Margaret when she saw the house inside and knew that it was hers, the tears she shed and smiles that grew almost into hysterics when she saw some of the incongruous furnishings, are all past describing. Margaret was too happy to think. She rushed from one room to another. She hugged her mother and linked her arm in her father's for a walk across the long piazza. She talked to Emily and Dick and Jane, and then rushed out to find Gardley and thank him again. And all this time she could not understand how Gardley had done it, for she had not yet comprehended his fortune. Gardley had asked his sisters to come to the wedding, not much expecting they would accept, but they had telegraphed at the last minute they would be there. They arrived an hour or so before the ceremony, gushed over Margaret, told Gardley she was a sweet thing, and the house was dandy for a house party if one had plenty of servants, but they should think it would be dull in winter. Gave Margaret a diamond sunburst pin, a string of pearls, and an emerald bracelet set in diamond chips, and departed immediately after the ceremony. They had thought they were the chief guests, but the relief that overspread the faces of those guests, who were best beloved by both bride and groom, was at once visible on their departure. Jasper Kemp drew a long breath and declared to Long Bill that he was glad the air was growing pure again. Then all those old friends from the bunk house filed in to the great tables heavily loaded with good things, the abundant gift of the neighborhood, and sat down to the wedding supper, heartily glad that the city lady and her gals, as Mom Wallis called them in a suppressed whisper, had chosen not to stay over a train. The wedding had been in the schoolhouse, embowered in foliage and all the flowers the land afforded, decorated by the loving hands of Margaret's pupils, old and young. She was attended by the entire school marching double file before her, strewing flowers in her way. The missionary's wife played the wedding march, and the missionary assisted the bride's father with the ceremony. Margaret's dress was a simple white muslin with a little real lace and embroidery handed down from former generations, the whole called into being by Margaret's mother. Even Gardley's sisters had said it was perfectly dear. The whole neighborhood was at the wedding, and when the bountiful wedding supper was eaten, the entire company of favored guests stood about the new piano and sang, "Blessed be the tie that binds," with Margaret playing for them. Then there was a little hurry at the last, Margaret getting into the pretty traveling dress and hat her mother had brought and kissing her mother good-bye, though happily not for long this time. Mother and father and the rest of the home party were to wait until morning, and the missionary and his wife were to stay with them that night and see them to their car the next day. So waving and throwing kisses back to the others, they rode away to the station, Bud pridefully driving the team from the front seat. Gardley had arranged for a private apartment on the train, and nothing could have been more luxurious in traveling than the place where he led his bride. Bud, scuttling behind with the suitcase, looked around him with all his eyes before he said a hurried good-bye and murmured under his breath, "Gee, wished I was going all the way." Bud hustled off as the train got under way, and Margaret and Gardley went out to the observation platform to wave a last farewell. The few light, blurring lights of Ashland died soon in the distance, and the desert took on its vast wideness beneath a starry dome. But off in the east a purple shadow loomed, mighty and majestic, and rising slowly over its crest a great silver disk appeared, brightening as it came and pouring a silver mist over the purple peak. "My mountain!" said Margaret softly, and Gardley, drawing her close to him, stooped to lay his lips upon hers. "My darling," he answered. End of chapter 34. End of A Voice in the Wilderness by Grace Livingston Hill.